The wagon that brought Elena Mercer to Iron Ridge Ranch broke a wheel 3 miles outside of town, and she walked the rest of the way in boots that had been resoled twice and were starting to separate at the left toe. She didn't complain about it. There was nobody to complain to. She arrived just before noon on a Thursday in late November, carrying a travel bag that weighed less than it should have for a woman starting over somewhere new. Inside, 2 dresses, a wool underskirt, a change of stockings, a small tin of dried lavender her mother used to keep in the linen cupboard, and a recipe journal with a cracked leather cover that had been repaired with a strip of rawhide. The journal had belonged to her mother. Her mother had been dead for 2 years. The journal was the only thing Elena had refused to sell when the creditors came. She stood at the front gate of Iron Ridge Ranch and looked at the place for a long moment before going in. It was bigger than she'd expected. The main house sat back from the road behind a wide yard of frozen mud, 2 stories of dark timber and stone with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front. Behind it, she could make out the roof lines of a bunkhouse, 2 barns, and what looked like a smokehouse. A water tower stood at the far edge of the property, and beyond that the land opened into broad white pasture that rolled up toward the foothills before disappearing into the tree line. The mountains behind everything were enormous and indifferent, wearing their snow with the quiet permanence of things that have been there long enough to stop caring about the opinion of the people below. There were men working in the yard. They noticed her and then went back to what they were doing. A dog barked once from somewhere near the barn and then went quiet. Elena picked up her bag and walked toward the house. The woman who answered the kitchen door was named Nora Callahan, and she looked at Elena the way most people in that territory had learned to look at strangers who showed up without warning and without obvious means. Carefully, without warmth, holding judgment in reserve until she decided what this person was going to cost her. "You the one who wrote about the cook's position?" Nora asked. "Yes, ma'am." "You're 2 days late. The stage was delayed at Pueblo, and then I walked the last 3 miles because the wagon lost a wheel." Nora looked at her boots. Then she looked at the bag. Then she looked at Elena's face, which was pale and wind-chapped and carrying the specific kind of calm that comes not from peace, but from having been through enough that panic has stopped being a useful option. "Come in," Nora said. "I'll get you some coffee." The kitchen was warm in a way that hit Elena like a physical thing after hours in the cold. It was a big room, well-equipped by frontier standards, a cast-iron range along the inner wall, a long oak work table down the center, shelves of preserved goods and dry staples, copper pots hanging from a ceiling rack that needed polishing. There was a window above the sink that looked out toward the barn, and the glass was frosted at the corners from the cold. Elena sat down at the table and put her bag on the floor beside her and wrapped both hands around the mug Nora set in front of her. "You cook?" Nora asked. She sat down across from her with her own cup, and her expression had shifted slightly, still cautious but willing to hear the answer. "My whole life," Elena said. "My mother taught me. She was the best cook in 3 counties. At least that's what people said. I don't know how to measure that kind of thing, but I know she never once served a meal she wasn't satisfied with, and I've tried to hold to that." "What happened to your family's farm?" Elena looked at the table. "Drought. 3 years of it. We held on longer than most because my father was stubborn and my mother was careful with money, but the 3rd year we lost everything. My father died before we had to sell. I think he would have found that harder than dying." She picked up her coffee. "My mother went the following spring. After that, there was nothing to hold on to." Nora was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Crow doesn't have patience for excuses or complications. He runs this place like a cattle operation, which means things work on a schedule, and he expects the people working for him to know what they're doing before they start doing it." "I understand." "He's not cruel," Nora said, and her tone made it clear she felt it was important to say this, but equally important not to oversell it. "But he's not easy. He lost someone years back. It changed him. He doesn't talk about it, and nobody here asks." "I'm not looking for easy," Elena said. "I'm looking for work." Nora studied her for another moment. Then she set down her cup and stood up. "I'll show you the pantry," she said. "Supper's at 6. The men eat before Mr. Crow. You can start tonight." But Silas Crow came home that night in a condition that nobody who worked for him would have described to his face, but that every one of them recognized and filed away in the mental ledger they all kept, the ledger that tracked how close the ranch was to the edge of something none of them could name, but all of them could feel. He came in through the front door at 7:30, after supper had already been served and the men were back in the bunkhouse. He'd been gone since before dawn, riding the northern fence line with two of his foremen to assess the damage from a storm that had moved through 2 days prior. What they found was worse than expected. A quarter-mile of fencing down, 3 steers dead in a gully, and evidence that this creek feeding the East Pasture's water trough had shifted course enough to leave it dry. These were not catastrophic problems individually. Together, in November, with winter not yet fully settled in and already this rough, they were the kind of problems that made a man ride home in silence. He was 41 years old. He'd built Iron Ridge from a single section of land his father left him, which had at the time been mortgaged to 60% of its value and carrying 2 years of back taxes. He had spent the better part of his adult life making that original failure into something nobody could argue with. The ranch now ran close to 3,000 head of cattle on 12 sections of deeded land, employed 37 men year-round, and had a reputation in the territory that was partly built on the quality of the beef it produced, and partly built on the fact that Silas Crow did not lose. He didn't lose disputes with neighbors. He didn't lose negotiations with buyers. He didn't lose men to injury or weather if he could possibly prevent it, and he didn't lose winters. But the last 3 had been hard, and the investors from the railroad had been making noise about the Ashcroft connection, about what a partnership with Vivian Ashcroft's father could do for a man who was land-rich, but starting to feel the squeeze of a cattle market that hadn't been kind this decade. Silas didn't like thinking about the Ashcroft situation. He didn't like the way it felt in his chest when he thought about it. Like a suit that was the right size but cut wrong, fitting without being comfortable. He came into the front hall and pulled off his coat and hung it without looking at it, and went toward the back of the house where the kitchen light was still on. He hadn't expected anyone to be in the kitchen at this hour. Nora usually had the evening meal covered and then retired early. The woman he found there instead was standing at the range with her back to him, sliding a pan of rolls into the oven. She didn't hear him come in. She was humming something low and tuneless under her breath, the way people hum when they're alone and not performing for anyone, just filling the silence because silence has weight, and sometimes you need to push back against it. He stood in the doorway for a moment. The kitchen smelled like bread and coffee and something else. Rosemary, maybe, or thyme. Something his mother used to grow in a clay pot on the windowsill. He hadn't thought about that in years. "I don't know who you are," he said. She turned around. He wasn't startled, or if she was, she absorbed it before it showed on her face. She had brown hair pulled back plainly and dark eyes, and a face that was ordinary-looking until she was looking at you directly, at which point it became difficult to describe as anything but direct. "Elena Mercer," she said. "Nora hired me this afternoon, cook's position." He looked at the kitchen. The work table was clean. The dishes from the men's supper were washed and stacked. There was a pot of something on the back burner of the range, the lid sitting slightly ajar to let steam escape. "Those rolls for tonight?" he asked. "For tomorrow's breakfast," she said, "but I kept some soup warm in case you hadn't eaten. You were out all day." He hadn't eaten, in fact. He'd had coffee at dawn and a strip of dried beef around noon and nothing since. He hadn't thought about it until she said it, and then his body registered the information with a kind of aggressive clarity that made him realize he was more exhausted than he'd acknowledged. "I'll get a bowl," he said. "Sit down," she said. "I'll get it." He thought briefly about saying something about that, about the fact that he didn't sit in his own kitchen and wait to be served like a guest in someone else's house. But he was tired, and the soup smelled like something that had been cooking long enough to mean it, and so he sat down at the end of the work table and didn't say anything. She set a bowl in front of him along with a plate of bread that was a day old but had been warmed in the oven. The soup was bean and salt pork with winter vegetables, simple and heavy in the way that cold days demanded. He ate without talking. She went back to the range and checked something and then began wiping down the counter without making it feel like she was waiting for him to be done so she could clean up after him. He ate the whole bowl and half the bread and then sat for a moment with his hands around the empty bowl. Outside the window, the wind was picking up again. He could hear it working at the corner of the house. "How long have you been cooking?" he said. It wasn't really a question he needed answered. It was more that the silence had shifted into a quality that invited something, and that seemed like the least intrusive thing to ask. "As long as I can remember," she said. She didn't elaborate. She wasn't performing humility or fishing for compliments. She'd answered the question, and that was the end of it. "Where before this?" My family's farm outside Haskell. Before that, nowhere in particular. She set down the cloth she'd been using and looked at him with that direct quality again. I know how to do the work. I don't need to prove it tonight, but I will by the end of the week if that's what it takes. Nora's judgment is good enough for me, he said. Then we understand each other. He pushed back from the table and stood up. He was a large man, not soft large, the other kind, the kind that comes from decades of physical work. And he carried it with the unconscious efficiency of someone who has never once thought about how they move because they've been too busy moving. He picked up the bowl and set it in the basin by the sink, which was the kind of thing he did automatically, and that Elena noticed without commenting on. There's coffee if you want it, she said. I'm going to bed, he said. He stopped at the doorway. The rolls? What time are you starting in the morning? 4:30, she said. He looked at her for a moment in the way he looked at men he was trying to figure out. Not unkind, but assessing, like he was reading something that wasn't quite in a language he knew. Then he nodded and went. She didn't sleep well her first night at Iron Ridge. This wasn't unusual. She'd stopped sleeping well the winter the farm failed, when the anxiety of watching something fall apart that no amount of work could stop had begun wiring itself into her nights. She'd learned to function on less than she needed and to take the rest when it came without chasing it when it didn't. Her room was small, off the back of the kitchen, a former storage room that Nora had cleared out and put a narrow bed and a washstand in. The mattress was better than she'd expected. There was a single window that looked out at the back of the property, and in the darkness she could see the outline of the mountains against the sky, which was clear and punishingly cold-looking, the stars hard and specific the way they got in high altitude on windless nights. She lay on her back and looked at the ceiling and went through the recipe journal in her head the way other people might count things to pass the time. Her mother's handwriting filled the journal in a combination of careful ink entries and hurried pencil notes that had been added later, revisions and improvements and the occasional crossed-out disaster. There were recipes for bread in 4 variations: white, rye, cornmeal, and a sweet egg bread her mother made at the end of harvest each year when there was enough flour and eggs to be generous with them. There were stews and soups for every season. There was a recipe for salt-cured pork that took 3 weeks and required more patience than most people had. There was a page near the back that was just a list of things her mother considered important in a kitchen. Not rules, more like principles, written in the shorthand of someone who'd thought about them for years and didn't need to explain them to herself. Good heat before the meat goes in. Season early, not at the end. Bread is alive, treat it accordingly. Never rush a simmer. Know what the cold does to lard before winter comes. Elena knew all of it by memory. She'd read the journal so many times that the physical act of reading it was almost beside the point. What she was really doing when she went through it in her head was something closer to conversation. With her mother, with the version of her childhood kitchen that existed now only in that set of pages, with the idea of the woman she was trying to be. She wasn't naive. She knew what Nora's hesitation had been about, and she could hear it in the way the foreman's wife had explained the position earlier that evening. The slight over-explanation, the mention of Vivian Ashcroft's name that wasn't quite accidental. She understood the arithmetic well enough. A cattle baron whose finances were under pressure, a wealthy banker's daughter being positioned as a solution, and a kitchen girl who'd walked in from nowhere with no connections and a cracked leather journal. She understood what she was in that equation, and she wasn't under any illusions about it. She wasn't there for Silas Crow. She was there for the wage and the roof and the chance to rebuild something solid enough to stand on. That was all. She closed her eyes. The wind found a gap somewhere in the wall and made a thin, sustained sound that was almost musical. Outside, the temperature was dropping. She was asleep before she knew it. Wumta. By the end of the first week, Elena had fed 37 men 3 meals a day, managed a pantry that was better stocked than she'd expected, but organized in a way that suggested nobody had thought about it for more than 3 minutes, and learned most of the ranch's rhythms without having to ask too many questions. She learned by watching. The men came in for breakfast before sunrise, loud and half awake, tracking mud and cold air, sitting down to whatever was on the table with the efficient appreciation of people who eat because they have work to do and not for any more complicated reason. She gave them what they needed: hot food in large quantities, coffee that was strong enough to function as a separate category of experience, and no fuss about the condition they arrived in. She didn't make conversation she didn't mean, and she didn't pretend to be cheerful when she wasn't. What she gave them instead was consistency, which in her experience was worth more than cheerfulness in the long run. She learned the names by listening. There was Cal, who was the head wrangler, and who ate everything put in front of him without comment, except on the days he thought the coffee wasn't strong enough, at which point he would set the cup down quietly and look at it with a kind of diplomatic disappointment. There was a man called Dawes, who was the lead stockman and who carried a worrying cough that had been going on since before Elena arrived, apparently, and that everybody had decided to treat as furniture rather than a symptom. There were two brothers named Holt, one of whom was funny and one of whom was not, and who sat next to each other at every meal with the specific comfort of people who have spent enough time together to not need to talk. Nora had her own role in the house. She managed the domestic accounts, supervised the cleaning women who came in twice a week, and kept the ordering of household supplies organized. She was good at her work and she knew it, and she'd initially held herself at a certain professional distance from Elena that was not unfriendly but that was clearly measured. By the third day, the distance had narrowed. By the end of the first week, Nora had started sitting down with Elena in the mid-afternoon when the men were at work, and the kitchen was at its quietest, and they talked about the kind of things that women in isolated places talk about when they finally find each other. The particular details of their work, the men they managed around, the weather, and what it would mean for the months ahead. "He came back for seconds last night," Nora said on Friday afternoon. She was mending something and didn't look up when she said it. "Who?" Elena said, though she knew. "Mr. Crow." Nora set down the mending. "He never goes back for seconds, not in the 2 years I've been here." "The soup had time to develop," Elena said. "First day's bean soup is always thinner than the second." Nora looked at her for a moment. Then she picked the mending back up. "Of course," she said, in a tone that meant she was noting Elena's answer without agreeing with the part of it that was deflection. Elena didn't expand on it. Silas Crow appeared in the kitchen 3 times that first week, which was, according to Nora, delivered without editorial comment, unusual. He came each time with a practical reason. Once to check the supply ledger that was kept on the kitchen shelf, once to tell her something about a delivery of salted beef coming Thursday that would need storage space, and once for reasons that he didn't explain and that Elena didn't ask about. He came in, he stood near the range, he said what he came to say or didn't say it, and then he left. He wasn't comfortable in the kitchen. She could see that. Not uncomfortable the way a man is who's out of his territory. More uncomfortable the way a man is who's been in a place and then been away from it long enough that coming back raises things he's not prepared to deal with. He stood near the stove with his arms crossed or his hands in his coat pockets, and he talked to the middle distance the way men did when they were speaking to women they hadn't figured out yet. But he came back. On Friday morning, she made her mother's rye bread, the one that required a long overnight rise and that came out of the oven with a crust that was somewhere between soft and crackling depending on the humidity. She made 4 loaves. The first 3 went to the men's table. The 4th she left wrapped in a cloth on the work table where it would still be warm when Silas came down for his morning coffee. She didn't know why she did it exactly. It wasn't strategy. It was more like instinct. The same instinct that had made her mother always keep something extra back, something specific, for the person in the house who was carrying the most. She didn't watch him find it. She was at the range when he came in. He picked up the loaf and stood there holding it for a moment. She could hear him. She kept her attention on the pan in front of her. "This the same bread from yesterday?" he said. "Different. That was white. This is rye. My mother's recipe." A pause. "Your mother taught you everything?" "Most of it." She turned the pan. "The rye is better in cold weather. The long rise gives it more depth." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he'd moved on, and then he said, "My mother made rye bread. I haven't thought about that in a long time." She didn't say anything. She knew, by some mechanism she couldn't have named, but that had to do with years of paying attention to what people needed in kitchens and at tables, that this wasn't a moment for response. It was a moment that needed to exist without being filled. He cut a slice and ate it standing at the work table. She heard him set the knife down. Then she heard him pour a cup of coffee and take it toward the door. "Thank you," he said from the doorway. She waited until she heard his boots in the hall before she let herself exhale. The snow came hard in the second week of December. It had been building for 3 days. The men could read it in the way the sky sat heavy and yellow-gray over the mountains, and in the way the cattle moved in from the upper pastures without being driven, animals understanding weather in ways that bypassed language. Silas had spent those 3 days redistributing feed, reinforcing the shelters on the east section, and making sure the water lines to the troughs had enough wrap on them to survive a hard freeze. When the storm finally hit, it hit with the seriousness of something that had been waiting for permission. Elena was awake at 4:30 as usual, had the range going by 5, and had biscuits and side pork and a large pot of oatmeal on the table by the time the men came in at 6, which they did in a rough and wind-scraped state that made it clear the path from the bunkhouse to the kitchen door had become a commitment rather than a walk. The kitchen door opened and closed all morning. Men came in to warm up between tasks, standing close to the range and not talking much, taking coffee and sometimes something from the bread basket and then going back out. Elena kept a pot going and didn't comment on the foot traffic. At mid-morning, Silas came in. She knew before she turned around that something was wrong. She could hear it in the way he moved, deliberately, with the particular kind of control that men used when they were fighting something in themselves that they didn't intend to show. He sat down at the table without being asked. He took off his hat and set it in front of him and looked at it. 3 men got turned around in the north pasture, he said. We got them back, but 2 of them were out there for close to 4 hours. One of them, Holt, the younger one, his hands are bad, frostbite or close to it. Where is he? Bunkhouse. Send him here, she said. I need warm water and cloth strips, and I'll need someone to keep the range stoked while I deal with his hands. He looked up at her. You know what to do for it? My father had frostbite twice, she said. I've handled it before. She was already moving to the stove to adjust the water she had heating. Don't put him near the fire directly. Warm water first, gradual. Keep him calm. Is he in pain? He will be when he thaws out. That's good, she said. Pain means the tissue is coming back. He was watching her with that same quality he'd had at their first meeting, assessing but not unkind, reading something that wasn't quite in a language he knew. Then he stood up and went back out. Young Holt arrived 20 minutes later, carried more than walked by his brother, his hands wrapped in a cloth, and his face the specific gray-white of a man who was maintaining consciousness through an act of will. Elena sat him down and unwrapped his hands and made herself look at them clinically rather than with the alarm she felt, which was significant. The fingers on his right hand were white and waxy to the second knuckle. I need you to look at me, she said. He looked at her. He was maybe 20 years old. He had the face of someone who'd been working outdoor jobs since he was a boy, and hadn't expected anything in particular to put him on the receiving end of help. This is going to hurt when it comes back, she told him. That's what you want. You understand? Yes, ma'am. Don't pull your hands away. I know you're going to want to. Don't. She worked for the better part of an hour. She warmed the water in stages, immersing his hands and speaking to him quietly, telling him what she was doing and why, keeping him in the present moment and away from the edges of shock. His brother sat beside him with his hand on his shoulder and didn't say anything, but also didn't leave. Nora came in at some point and Elena put her to work without looking up from what she was doing. By the time she was done, Holt's color had come back, and the pain, which had arrived on schedule and with considerable force, had receded to a point he could manage. His right hand would need watching over the next few days, but she didn't think he'd lose the fingers. You should sleep, she told him. The work will be there when you wake up, she said. If anyone tells you different, tell them to come talk to me. He looked at her with an expression that was complicated, gratitude and something else, something more like recalibration, like a person who'd come in expecting one thing and encountered something different and hadn't finished processing it yet. Yes, ma'am, he said. His brother helped him back to the bunkhouse. Nora stood at the sink and looked at Elena with an expression that she was trying to keep neutral. Where did you learn to do that? My mother, Elena said, and necessity. She began cleaning up. Can you put some broth on for noon? Something simple. The men will need it after this morning. Of course, Nora said. She said it the way she'd been saying things to Elena all week, with something building behind the words that she hadn't yet said directly. But she said it, and she put the broth on, and the kitchen kept going. Silas didn't come to the kitchen that night. He ate with his foreman in the dining room, as he did on the days when there were things that needed to be settled among the men who ran the operation. Elena heard the low sound of voices from down the hall while she was cleaning up, and she didn't try to make out what was being said. It wasn't her business. What she knew was this: the storm wasn't done, and the winter wasn't close to done, and 3,000 cattle on 12 sections of land in the Colorado Territory needed tending regardless of what the weather decided to do. She'd heard enough at supper to understand that the north fence damage was only the beginning of what needed addressing, and that the financial situation was more pressured than anyone said out loud, but that everyone communicated in the particular ways that people communicate when they're worried about something they're not supposed to be worried about in front of others. She also knew, and had known since she'd walked through the front gate, that places like this ran on the margins. Everything Silas had built ran on the margins. A bad year or two, and the margins shrank. A bad winter, and they could disappear. She thought about that while she banked the fire for the night. She thought about what her mother used to say about kitchens, that a kitchen was the place where a house either held together or didn't, and that most people didn't notice which was happening until it was too late. She turned off the lamp and stood for a moment in the dark kitchen, listening to the wind before going to her room. Outside, the snow continued to fall. It fell on the fields and the rooftops and the fence lines and the frozen creek, and it fell on the cattle in their shelters and on the mountains above them, adding to what was already there, building towards something that nobody could yet measure, but everyone could feel. She woke in the night once to the sound of the wind at its loudest, and lay there listening to it until it settled, and then went back to sleep. In the morning, she was at the range at 4:30, same as always. The bread would take time to rise, and she had no reason to hurry it. The storm broke on its fourth day, the way bad things sometimes do. Not gradually, but all at once, the wind dropping in the middle of the night, and leaving behind a silence so complete it woke Elena before her alarm. She lay in her narrow bed and listened to the absence of sound for a long moment before she understood what it meant, and then she got up and went to the kitchen. The cold outside the window was a different kind of cold now, still brutal, but settled. The sky, when it started to lighten, was the clear, hard blue of weather that had said everything it had to say. She built the fire in the range and put the water on and stood with her hands wrapped around herself while the kitchen came back up to temperature, and she thought about what needed doing. She'd been at Iron Ridge for 3 weeks now. 3 weeks was long enough to understand a place's bones, where the dry goods were running low, which men would eat anything, and which had specific complaints they expressed through silence rather than words. How many hours the range needed before it held a consistent bake temperature in different weather conditions, which corner of the kitchen drafting from a gap in the wall she'd stuffed with rags, but that still breathed cold air when the wind was from the northwest. She knew the bones. Now she was starting to understand the muscle and the nerves. The bread she had proofing from the night before was ready. She slid the pans into the oven and started on the rest of breakfast, moving in the way she moved when she was properly awake and working. Not hurried, not performatively efficient, just in a direct line between what needed doing and the doing of it. Cal appeared first, as he always did, 20 minutes before the other men, with the slightly aggrieved expression of someone who'd hoped sleep might go longer, but had made his peace with it not doing so. He poured his own coffee by now without asking her, which was a thing that had happened gradually and that she took as something like acceptance. "Temperature dropped hard last night," he said. "I noticed," she said. "East Trough's going to be frozen solid. 2 of the boys are already out there. Coffee's fresh, and I'll have something on the table in 20 minutes. He drank his coffee standing at the window, looking at the yard in the flat, early light. "The Holt boy's doing better," he said, without looking at her. "Hands are near normal. He says to tell you thank you." "He said that himself?" "Well," Cal set down his cup, "he said it in the way men like Holt say things. I'm interpreting." She almost smiled. She didn't, but it was close. The men came in, ate, went back out. The morning ran the way mornings ran when the weather had relented, with a kind of compressed energy, everything that couldn't be done during the worst of the storm needing to happen now before the next one. There was fence to fix and cattle to move and inventory that needed to be taken on the hay supply. She could hear the activity in the yard without needing to see it. Silas left at first light with his 2 senior foremen and didn't come back until mid-afternoon. She heard him in the front hall when he returned and heard him go upstairs, and then she didn't hear him again for a while. When he came into the kitchen, it was close to 4 o'clock, after the men's midday meal had been cleared and before she'd started on the evening. He looked better than he had during the storm, less wound, less like a man carrying something in both hands that he couldn't set down. Not relaxed, which was probably not a state he naturally occupied, but something closer to operational. "The east fence is fixable," he said. He pulled out the stool at the end of the work table and sat on it rather than at it. One boot on the floor and one on the rung, the way a man sits when he intends to be somewhere for a specific amount of time and not longer. The creek is the bigger problem. It's shifted enough that the east pasture trough won't fill reliably from it this winter. "Will you reroute it?" "Have to." He looked at the work table where she was trimming dried herbs from the bundles that Nora had hanging above the window. "That going in something specific?" "Venison stew for tonight," she said. "We got a deer from the Holt brothers Tuesday. I've been waiting for the right night." "In this cold, venison needs long and slow," she said. "Yes, I started it this morning." He looked at the pot on the back of the range without saying anything. The kitchen smelled like it. She'd put juniper berries in it, which her mother had always done with wild game, and dried onion and a small amount of vinegar that she added at the beginning rather than the end because she'd found it did something different that way. Softened the flavor rather than sharpening it. "Cal told me what you did for the Holt boy," Silas said. "It wasn't complicated." "It was more than complicated," he said. "People freeze to death in this territory because nobody knew what to do or did the wrong thing. You knew what to do." She didn't answer immediately. She was working the herbs between her palms to release the oil before adding them to the stew, and she finished what she was doing before she turned around. "My father lost 2 fingers on his right hand to frostbite," she said, "the year I was 12. My mother couldn't save those. She always believed she would have if she'd known sooner what she was dealing with. She made sure I knew." He was watching her with a steadiness that was different from the assessment he'd been doing in the first week. She couldn't have precisely said what had changed, only that something had. "You can stay through winter," he said, "if you were uncertain about the position." She looked at him. "I wasn't uncertain about the position." "No," he said. "I don't suppose you were." He stood up from the stool. 6 o'clock for supper?" 6 o'clock, she said. He picked up his hat from the table and left. She stood for a moment after he'd gone, her hand still carrying the smell of juniper and dried thyme, and she thought about the fact that she hadn't been uncertain about the position, but that she was uncertain about other things, and that she was going to need to be careful about knowing the difference. Christmas came and went with the specific muted quality that hard-working places gave to holidays, acknowledged but not amplified. Elena made a proper Christmas dinner, roast beef from one of the steers that had been slaughtered in November for winter provisions, potato gratin with the last of the good cheese from the supply run, pickled beets, and a dried apple pie that had taken her the better part of a morning because the pastry wanted to crack in the dry, cold air, and she'd had to work it differently than her mother's notes suggested. She also made a smaller batch of molasses cookies, which she left at the end of the men's table without comment, and which were gone within 10 minutes of the men sitting down. Nobody made a speech. Nobody was sentimental about it. But the meal was longer than usual, and the men sat at the table talking after they'd finished, instead of going straight back to the bunkhouse. And that was something. Silas ate in the dining room with Nora and her husband Tom, who was the head carpenter, and who lived in a small house at the edge of the property with their 2 children. Elena ate in the kitchen, which was where she ate, which was fine. She'd eaten alone in a kitchen for most of her adult life, and she knew the particular quality of that silence. Not lonely, exactly, more like the quiet that belongs specifically to the person who has fed everyone else and is now at rest. She was finishing her pie when Nora came in to tell her that Silas wanted to see her in the dining room. She wiped her hands and went. The dining room was a room she'd been in only a handful of times, delivering dishes or collecting them. It was the most formal room in the house. A long oak table, 8 chairs, a sideboard with glass doors, a cast-iron heating stove in the corner that had been kept going all day. There was a rifle on the wall above the sideboard, and a painting on the opposite wall of a mountain landscape that someone had brought a long way to put there. Silas was standing at the window. He turned when she came in. "I wanted to thank you for today," he said. "The dinner, the men they're better tonight than I've seen them in a while." "It's a good crew," she said. "They've had better Christmases." He said it without elaboration, but with a weight that made it clear he knew what he meant and expected she understood the shape of it without needing the details. People carry things better when they've eaten well, she said. That's not a complicated truth. He turned back to the window for a moment. Outside, the night was clear and very cold, the yard lit by the moon off the snow. My foreman tells me you reorganized the dry storage. The previous arrangement was losing to moisture from the south wall, she said. I moved the grain sacks to the north shelves. You'll need to look at that wall in spring. There's water getting in somewhere. He also tells me you've been doing inventory. I have concerns about the flour supply through February, she said. If we're at full capacity with the men, we'll run short before the next supply run unless the order is adjusted. I wrote it down if you want to see it. He looked at her. You wrote it down. It seemed like something you'd want to see in writing rather than have someone tell you, and then forget which numbers they'd said. A pause. Then, with something in his face that was not quite a smile but occupied the same general area. Yes, I'll look at it. She nodded. She turned to go. Mercer, he said. She stopped. Take tomorrow morning, he said. You've worked every morning since you got here. Take the morning. She thought about saying she didn't need it. She thought about saying she had bread proofing. She thought about the fact that both of those things were true and that she was going to say them anyway because that was the kind of woman she was, and she stopped herself. Thank you, she said instead. January arrived with the implacable certainty of a creditor. The cold deepened in a way that stopped feeling like weather and started feeling like geology, like something that was simply the nature of the place rather than a condition it was passing through. The men wore their heaviest gear for work that should have been medium gear work, and they came in from the fields with the kind of tired that sleep only partially resolved. Elena's days settled into a shape that she understood and that kept her functioning. Early mornings at the range, the rhythms of feeding 37 men at intervals, the mid-afternoon lull that she used for inventory or for sitting with her mother's journal and thinking about what she might make that could do the most good for people in this kind of sustained cold. She'd found that it mattered, the specific thing she fed people, not just quantity. Quantity kept them going, but quality, specific combinations of fat and warmth and flavor, did something to their morale that she couldn't have explained scientifically, but that she'd seen enough times to believe in. She started making bone broth and keeping it going on the back burner all day. So there was always something hot and restorative for the men who came in from particularly rough shifts. She started baking more than she strictly needed to, so there were always rolls or biscuits or the rye bread available between meals, something a man could grab without having to wait for mealtime. Small adjustments. She didn't announce them, she just made them. Nora noticed. Cal noticed. The men noticed in the particular way that people notice when something has improved without being able to put their finger on exactly what changed. Silas noticed differently. He came to the kitchen more in January than he had in December. She was aware of this without making it significant. He came in for the ledger, or to tell her something about a supply delivery, or because he'd been in that part of the house for another reason, and the warmth of the kitchen made the detour worth it. He didn't stay long, and he didn't say much beyond what he'd come to say, but he came, and he stayed a little longer each time before he went. She didn't encourage it. She also didn't discourage it. She cooked, and she managed the kitchen, and she treated him the way she treated everyone who came through, directly, without performance, offering what was needed and not offering more. She knew that was what she was doing and why she was doing it, and she knew it was at least partly that she didn't know what else to do. On a Tuesday evening in the middle of January, she was making the dough for the next morning's bread when he came in later than usual, after 9, which was past the point when the kitchen was generally occupied by anyone. She heard the back door and then his boots on the stone floor and didn't turn around. I didn't think anyone was still in here, he said. I stay until the bread's set, she said. The overnight rise. I started doing it earlier and it wasn't coming out right in this cold. She could hear him moving behind her, to the range, where the bone broth was still sitting warm, which he knew by now was always available. She heard him ladle some into a cup. Long day, she said. Vivian Ashcroft is coming up from Denver. He said it with the flat quality of a man delivering information he'd been carrying for a while and was now setting down. Next week. Her father's arranging it. Elena kept her hands in the dough. I see. She'll need a room prepared, something suitable. I'll have Nora see to the bedding. I can manage the kitchen side of it, Elena said, if there are preferences I should know about. She likes French cooking, he said, or so I'm told, whatever that means out here. I can work with it. She folded the dough. How long will she be staying? A pause. 4 days, maybe 5. I'll have what I need. He was quiet behind her long enough that the silence acquired a character she didn't know how to name. Then he said, You don't have anything to say about it. She stopped working. She turned around. He was standing at the work table with the cup in his hands, looking at her with the specific directness of a man who was tired of indirect things and was going to say what he meant, even if he hadn't entirely decided he meant it yet. It's not my business, she said. I'm asking anyway. She looked at him steadily. You want my opinion on the Ashcroft situation. I'm asking what you think. She considered. She knew the shape of what she was being asked, and she knew that honesty and wisdom were not always the same thing, and she knew that what she was about to say could change the specific balance of things in a way she wasn't sure she was prepared for. I think, she said carefully, that you're a man who has built something real, and that you're being asked to consider trading something you don't yet know the value of for something that comes with a very clear price tag. And I think you already know which direction you're leaning. She picked up her cloth and wiped her hands. That's what I think. He looked at her for a long moment. She couldn't read his face, which was unusual. She could read most faces, had been reading the kitchen faces of people her whole life, and his was the most complicated one she'd encountered. The ranch needs capital, he said. The Ashcroft money would solve problems that won't solve themselves. Yes, she said. That's not nothing. No, she said. It isn't. But I didn't say but, she said. I said that's what I think. What you do with it is your decision and not mine. He set down the cup. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the end of the table. He was going, she could tell, and she let him go, and then he stopped at the door. The bread, he said. Tomorrow morning. 6:30, she said. As usual. He nodded and went out. She stood in the kitchen with the unfinished dough in front of her, and the bone broth still warming on the back of the range, and the cold quiet of late January surrounding the house on every side. And she allowed herself exactly one moment of something that she didn't name because naming it would have made it a thing she'd have to deal with. And then she put her hands back in the dough. Vivian Ashcroft arrived on a Wednesday with a trunk, a small leather case, a personal maid named Hester who looked at the ranch with the expression of someone mentally composing a letter to her future self about how she'd survived this, and a quality of self-possession that Elena recognized immediately as the product of a life in which other people had always managed the difficult parts. She was beautiful in the specific and somewhat inconvenient way of women who are beautiful without appearing to work at it. Dark hair, a good complexion, clothes that had been made by someone who was very good at their work. She was 26 or 27, Elena guessed. She had the manners of a woman who'd been raised to be observed and had made peace with it without exactly enjoying it. She came to the kitchen on her first afternoon while Silas was out with his foreman, which Elena suspected was not accidental. "You're the cook?" Vivian said from the doorway. "Elena Mercer," Elena said. She was at the table breaking down a side of salt pork, and she set down the knife and wiped her hands. "Yes." Vivian looked at the kitchen with a cataloging sort of attention. "It's more functional than I expected." "We feed 40 people 3 times a day," Elena said. "Yes, of course." She came in a little further. She was looking at Elena with an attention that was not unkind but that was very thorough, the way a person looks at something they're trying to understand the significance of. "Silas mentioned you've made improvements." "I've tried to make the kitchen run more efficiently," Elena said. "That's what I was hired for." "Of course." There was a pause in which neither of them addressed the specific current of what was actually being said. Then Vivian said, "I wondered if you might be able to manage something a bit lighter for dinner tonight. I've been traveling for 2 days, and I find I don't have much appetite for heavy food." "I was planning roast chicken," Elena said, "with roasted root vegetables and a broth soup first." "Would that suit?" "That would be lovely." She said it in the way of someone who said things like that so often it had become automatic. Then she looked at Elena with something more direct. "How long have you been here?" 7 weeks. "And before?" My family's farm. And before that? There wasn't a before that, Elena said. She said it without rancor, which somehow made it more final than if she'd been defensive about it. Vivian looked at her for a moment. I see, she said. And she said it in a way that suggested she did see, and that what she saw was more complicated than she'd expected. She left the kitchen without saying anything else. The roast chicken was good. Elena made sure of it, not because she was trying to impress Vivian, but because she made everything as well as she could, and that wasn't something she had an off switch for. The soup first, then the chicken with the skin crisped and the meat falling off in the right way, and the vegetables roasted with dried herbs and a small amount of lard that turned them sweet at the edges. She sent it to the dining room with Nora, and she didn't go in herself. From the kitchen, she could hear the low sound of conversation. Vivian's voice, which was smooth and even, and Silas's, which was different in the dining room than it was in the kitchen, more formal, more careful with its edges. She couldn't make out words, which was not something she tried to do. She cleaned up, and she started the next morning's bread, and she didn't try to hear what was being said, but she heard the specific quality of quiet that came from the dining room later in the evening, after Vivian had retired, when Silas came and stood in the kitchen doorway for a while. He didn't come in. She didn't turn around. He stood there for maybe 3 minutes, and then she heard him go upstairs. She thought about that later, in her room. She thought about what she knew and what she didn't know, and about the difference between things that were her business and things that felt like they were, but weren't, and about the particular difficulty of being in a position where the same qualities that made her good at her work also made the edges of it harder to see. She fell asleep with her mother's journal on the bed beside her, which was not something she usually did, and which she didn't notice until she woke in the morning and found it there. Vivian left on Saturday, a day earlier than planned. Elena didn't know the circumstances. Nora told her, with the particular economy of someone who was choosing their words with care, that the visit had not gone exactly as the Ashcroft side had anticipated. Silas had been civil and hospitable throughout, Nora said, but there was a quality to it. She searched for the word. A quality of distance that couldn't be closed no matter how good the dinner was. He was polite, Nora said. He was perfectly polite. But polite isn't the same as interested. Elena was folding linens, and she kept folding them. She knew, Nora said. Vivian, she knew before she came, I think, that it wasn't going to work. She struck me as a woman who doesn't miss what's in front of her. A pause. She said the chicken was the best she'd had. That's kind of her, Elena said. Elena. She looked up. Nora was watching her with an expression that was difficult to categorize, but that had something maternal in it, or something like what Elena imagined maternal looked like. She'd been young enough when her mother got sick that some of those years were blurry now. Be careful, Nora said. Elena looked at her. I'm not saying anything, Nora said. I'm just saying be careful. Elena set down the linen. I'm being careful, she said. I'm being very careful. Nora accepted this and didn't push it further, and the conversation moved to other things, and Elena went back to the kitchen and started on the midday meal, and she thought about being careful and what that meant in practice, and whether careful was the same as safe, and whether safe was something a person in her position could afford to be confused about. The gossip started in February. She heard it the way she heard most things that weren't intended for her ears, not directly, but in the particular way a kitchen positioned between the men's spaces and the main house picked up the currents of a large operation. A word here in the yard when the kitchen window was cracked. A conversation stopped when she came into the storeroom where 2 of the hands were taking inventory. The version she heard was rough and not sophisticated. The kitchen girl had gotten above herself, had gotten ideas, had driven off the banker's daughter with whatever she was doing, had the cattle king turned around to where he didn't know what was good for him anymore. She heard it, and she processed it, and she kept doing her work. She'd heard versions of this before. At every step of her life where she'd been somewhere she wasn't expected to last, she'd heard versions of this. The doubt that preceded her, the skepticism that trailed her, the specific form of dismissal that people applied to women who had neither money nor connections as their justification for being somewhere. She'd learned that the only argument against it that actually worked was the continuous fact of the work itself. Talking didn't answer it. Defending herself didn't answer it. The bread on the table every morning answered it. and the full pot of broth on the back burner, and the fact that the Holt boy still had all his fingers. So she didn't defend herself. She went to work. There was a morning in mid-February when she came in from the cold storeroom to find 3 of the hands sitting at the kitchen table, a position they'd assumed lately with the ease of people who'd stopped thinking of the kitchen as someone else's territory. And one of them, a man named Rudy, who'd been at the ranch longer than most and who had views he expressed freely, said something to the man beside him that included the phrase, cooking her way into a position she wasn't hired for, which he said at a volume that was not quite accidental. She set the crate she was carrying on the work table. She looked at it. She said nothing. She said nothing for a long enough time that the silence became uncomfortable. And then she said, still without looking at them, "If any of you want breakfast before you go out, I'd sit somewhere other than the work table. I'm going to need the full length of it in about 10 minutes. Rudy's jaw tightened. He looked at her. She looked at him. After a moment, all 3 of them moved. She didn't know if she'd won something or just declined to lose it. But she set out the bread and the side pork and the coffee in the same way she set it out every morning, and the men ate it, Rudy included, and she went on. The thing that nobody had yet said in her presence, but that she understood was being said in other places, was this. Why was she still here? Not in the sense of the job was clear, but in the sense of the kitchen at 9 o'clock at night, when Silas came in for broth or coffee, or the specific kind of company that had no formal description, because no formal description had been needed yet. In the sense of the way the house had changed, not dramatically, not in any way you could point to, but in the slow and definite way a place changes when the person who tends it has stopped just maintaining and started caring. She'd done something she hadn't planned. She'd made a home out of a kitchen, the way women of her particular kind of character did without intending to, by caring about what they touched and taking seriously the responsibility of nourishing people who were working hard and living in ways that stripped them down to something essential. And the house, which had been running on discipline and routine and the sheer willpower of a man who'd decided grief was not a thing he had time for, had started to breathe differently. She noticed it in small things. The dining room table, which Nora had told her nobody had used for anything other than business dinners in over 2 years, had been set for the ranch foreman's meeting last Tuesday in a way that suggested someone had thought about it. She suspected Silas, though she didn't ask. The heating stove in the front hall had started being kept going through the evening instead of banked at sundown. The painting in the dining room that had been hanging slightly crooked since she'd first seen it had been straightened. She didn't take responsibility for any of this. She wasn't sure responsibility was the right word. What she thought, when she thought about it at all, was that places responded to people who meant it. That was her mother's idea, embedded so deep in her that she couldn't have separated it from herself if she'd tried. Places respond to people who mean it. She meant it. She'd always meant it. That had never been the question. The question, the one she was being careful about, the one Nora had named and that she'd acknowledged without naming back, was a different thing entirely, and she wasn't ready to look at it directly yet. She kept the broth warm. She kept the bread rising. She kept the kitchen going in the way a kitchen needed to go in order for everything around it to hold. Outside, February ground on with its particular brand of relentlessness, the kind that made March feel like a rumor rather than a certainty, and the mountains sat above everything with their permanent indifference. And at Iron Ridge Ranch, 37 men and 1 woman and a cattle baron who had started coming to the kitchen for reasons he hadn't yet put into words, kept doing the work that needed doing, day after day, in the cold that showed no sign of having anywhere else to be. March came in like a man who'd lost an argument and wasn't ready to admit it. Not cold enough to be winter anymore. Not warm enough to be anything else. With a sky that couldn't decide what it wanted to do and changed its mind every 3 hours. The snow was still deep in the high country, but it had softened in the lower pastures. And that softening, which should have been a relief, was instead creating a problem that Silas had been watching develop for 2 weeks, with the specific dread of someone who can see exactly what's coming and can't stop it. The problem was this. He had just under 300 head of cattle that needed to reach the railhead at Colton before the season buying closed at the end of March. Colton was on the other side of the Grenner Range, 40 miles of mountain country, that was never simple in the best conditions. In normal years, there were 2 viable routes through. The North Pass through Haverford Gap was the faster one, lower elevation, better footing, a road that had been used by cattle outfits for 30 years. The south route through Saddle Creek was slower but more forgiving of late-season ice. Both routes were gone. The North Pass had been hit by an avalanche in late February, which had deposited a wall of compacted snow and debris across the road at its narrowest point. A wall, Cal had reported after riding up to assess it, that would take 2 weeks and heavy equipment to clear. 2 weeks was 3 weeks too long. The south route through Saddle Creek had been claimed quietly and then less quietly by a cattle operation called the Danner Outfit. 4 men, 2 of whom had reputations that went ahead of them in the way of men who were useful to people who needed things done without too many questions asked. The Danner crew had moved into the Saddle Creek country in January and were running their own herd through it. Attempting to push 300 head of Iron Ridge cattle through that stretch would not end in paperwork. Silas laid this out at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning in early March, which was where he'd taken to having his working conversations when they involved more than 2 people, because the kitchen table was longer than the desk in his office, and because Elena kept coffee on the range all morning and nobody had to think about it. He had Cal on his left, his senior foreman Breckett on his right, and his junior foreman Moss at the far end. Elena was at the range. She was not part of the meeting and had not been invited to the meeting. She was making the dough for the afternoon bread, and she was not looking at the table. "The Haverford slide isn't moving before May," Cal said. "I've seen that kind of debris field. You can't work through it in March." "Danner won't negotiate," Breckett said. He was a compact man in his mid-40s who'd been with Silas for 8 years and who expressed his opinions in the fewest words that could contain them. "I talked to one of their men last week. They're running their herd through the end of the month. They know our position. They put themselves there because they know our position," Moss said. Moss was younger and said things like that. True things, but said them in a way that made them feel like an accusation rather than a contribution. "Alternate buyers?" Silas said. "Nearest alternative railhead is Portsmouth," Cal said. "That's 60 miles the wrong direction, and the buying price there runs 15 cents a hundredweight below Colton. So we eat the difference. On 300 head at this weight class, that's close to $400. Nobody said anything for a moment. Elena could hear the silence from the range. $400 against the winter they'd had, against the fence repairs, and the creek rerouting and the lost steers and the hay shortfall that had cost them twice what it should have. $400 was not a number anyone at that table could treat as abstract. "There has to be something else," Moss said. "There has to be another way through those mountains." "The maps don't show one," Breckett said. "The maps don't show everything," Elena said. She said it without turning around. She said it the way she said most things, not loudly, not trying to insert herself, just the way you say something that is true and that needs to be said and that you've been holding for the last 10 minutes while the men at the table talked themselves into a corner. The kitchen went quiet. She turned around. 4 men were looking at her with varying degrees of surprise, which she registered and set aside. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "Go ahead," Silas said. She wiped her hands and came to the table but didn't sit down. She stood at the end opposite Moss and she looked at the rough map that Breckett had spread across the table, hand-drawn, the kind of thing that accumulated over years from people who'd ridden the land and added what they knew. "My father had a parcel up near the Grenner Range when I was a child," she said. "He sold it before the drought. He sold everything he could before the drought, which is how we lasted as long as we did. But when I was young, maybe 8 or 9, he used to take me up into that country." She looked at the map. The area she was thinking of was unmarked, which was not surprising. There's a drainage that runs northeast off the backside of Grenner Peak. Not a pass, exactly. More like a natural shelf. My father called it the kettle because of the shape. There's a way through it if you know where you're going. Cal leaned forward. "I've ridden that country. I don't know any kettle. It's not a route people use," she said. "My father found it by accident. He was tracking a horse that had gotten loose in a storm and followed it up into the high ground. It's narrow and it gains elevation before it comes back down, but—" She stopped. She was trying to remember it with the accuracy that 20-plus years in childhood memory allowed, which was not the same as certainty. "But I think it's wide enough for cattle if they're moved carefully. And my father said it always faced south, which meant it got more sun than the main passes, which means it might be clear or clearer." "You think," Breckett said. "Not unkind, just calibrating." "I think," she said, I haven't been up there in a long time, but my father was a careful man, and he didn't describe things he wasn't sure of. He'd been through that route twice by the time he told me about it. Silas was looking at the map. He wasn't looking at her, but she could tell he was listening in the specific way he listened when something had caught him, with his whole attention, even when his attention appeared to be somewhere else. "How far above the main route?" he said. "Higher. Probably 400 feet of elevation gain before it plateaus and comes down the other side. Maybe 3 miles of exposed country at the top." She thought about it. The plateau section would be the risk. If there's ice up there... "What's the alternative?" Moss said, which was the most useful thing he'd said all morning. Nobody answered that because they'd already gone through the alternatives and arrived here. Silas looked up from the map. He looked at her. "Could you find it again?" She met his eyes. "I'd need to scout it first. I couldn't promise anything from memory alone." "I'm not asking you to promise anything. I'm asking if you could find it." She thought about her father, about the specific way he moved in that country, unhurried and reading the land the way other men read print. His hand on her shoulder pointing out the things she wouldn't have noticed on her own. She thought about the way the terrain had felt under her feet, the particular angle of the light on the south-facing rock, the sound the wind made differently in the kettle than it did on the open mountainside. "Yes," she said. "I think I can find it." They left before dawn on Thursday, which gave them the best light of the day for the elevation gain, and 2 days before Silas needed to make a final decision about the Portsmouth route if the kettle didn't pan out. Silas went himself, along with Cal and a hand named Garrett, who was the best rider on the property, and who had the useful quality of not saying things he didn't need to say. Elena rode a gray mare named Ducket that was reliable in rough terrain, if not fast, which was what she needed. She had not been on a horse regularly in several years, which she didn't mention because mentioning it wouldn't have changed anything. The first hour she felt it in her hips and the inside of her knees, a soreness she recognized from the years when riding had been daily and that she'd simply have to work through. The terrain climbed quickly out of the Iron Ridge pastures into scrub pine and then into the denser timber of the lower mountain slopes. The snow was still significant above the tree line, 2 feet in the open and deeper in the drifts, but the trees had shed most of what they'd been carrying in the recent warm days, and the going was clear enough that they made decent time through the first few miles. Elena led. This required a specific kind of confidence she had to assemble from pieces that weren't quite whole. The memory was there. She could feel it. But memory at this distance and in this landscape was like trying to read something in low light. You knew the words were there. You had to let your eyes adjust. She didn't talk much while she was navigating. Silas rode behind her without pressing her, which she was grateful for. Cal was behind him. Garrett brought up the rear. They broke out of this timber at a ridgeline that Elena recognized with a clarity that surprised her. Not because she doubted the memory exactly, but because the gap between knowing something and seeing it again was larger than she'd anticipated. And when the gap closed, when the shape of the ridgeline matched the shape she'd been carrying for 20 years, something in her chest released. "Up here," she said. The ridge ran northeast as her father had described it. The south face opened to the March sun, and she could see immediately that he'd been right about the exposure. The snow on this face was shin-deep rather than knee-deep, and there were stretches where the bare rock showed through entirely. Not clear, but clearer. They rode along the ridge for half a mile before the terrain opened into what her father had called the kettle. It was a natural depression in the mountain, maybe 200 yards across at its widest, the walls curving up on 3 sides in a way that sheltered the interior from the worst of the north wind and concentrated what sun there was. The snow inside it was packed hard and even, workable. On the far side, she could see where the shelf she remembered continued, angling gradually downward toward the backside of the range. She stopped Ducket at the edge and looked at it. "That's it," she said. Cal came up beside her and they both looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "It's passable," Cal said. The tone of a man who was surprised and didn't see a reason to hide it. "That south wall, the ice melt is running off. That's why the floor is packed hard. It's been draining all week." "Will it hold cattle?" Silas said. He was looking at the far side at the continuation of the shelf. 300 head if they're spaced out and moved slow, Cal said. "You'd want to take it in sections. Move 50 at a time and bring the drovers back before pushing the next group. It'll take the better part of 2 days." The alternative costs us $400, Silas said. Then I'd say we're moving cattle through the kettle, Cal said. Elena was still looking at the bowl of the depression, at the specific quality of the light on the south wall. She was thinking about her father, about the afternoon he'd shown it to her, the way he'd said in his careful and understated way that it was good to know the shape of the country you lived in, because the country didn't change the way other things changed, and there were times when knowing a thing like that could matter. She hadn't known then that it would matter like this. We should check the far side before we commit, she said. Make sure the descent is what I remember. Garrett, Silas said. Garrett nodded and put his horse forward without being asked twice. They waited. Elena got down from Duckett and walked to the edge of the kettle and looked at the surface underfoot. The packed snow was solid. It would hold cattle weight if they weren't crowded and weren't pushed. The wall on the north side was still heavy with ice, but the south wall was what mattered, and the south wall was working in their favor. Garrett came back in 20 minutes. Descent's clean, he said. Runs about a mile before it levels into the timber. From there, it's a straight shot to the Colton Road. I'd estimate 6-7 hours of drive time if everything holds. Silas looked at Elena. She looked back at him. There was a long moment in which neither of them said anything, and in which the wind came across the ridgeline with a sound that had the first edge of warmth in it. Not warm, but no longer purely cold, carrying the suggestion of a season that still existed somewhere on the other side of these mountains. We start Sunday, Silas said. The preparation took 2 days. Elena spent both of them in the kitchen, cooking for a crew that needed to be fed well before and after what was going to be a demanding push, packing provisions for the drovers who would be out for 2 nights, managing the logistics of feeding the men who were staying behind to manage the ranch while the drive was on. She worked 16-hour days and she didn't complain about it, and nobody asked her to. On Saturday evening, Silas came to the kitchen and found her packing the trail provisions: dried beef, hard biscuits, salt pork wrapped in cloth, dried apple, and a small crock of honey because she'd learned that honey in cold weather was the fastest way to restore energy to a man who was running low. You should sleep tonight, he said. I will when I'm done, she said. You found us a route through an impossible situation, he said. You don't need to provision the whole drive, too. She looked at him. The men who are driving 300 cattle through a mountain shelf in March need good provisions. That's my job. I'm going to do it. He looked at the table. The organized rows of what she'd packed, each bundle tied with a strip of cloth and labeled in her handwriting. He picked up one of the biscuit packets and turned it over in his hands. Your father was a particular kind of man, he said. He was, she said. He paid attention. He thought that what you knew was only as good as when you needed it, and so he was always filing things away. She kept working. He never thought the farm would fail. He'd prepared for everything except something that took 3 years to build instead of hitting all at once. I don't think anybody's fully prepared for the kind of thing that takes its time. No, Silas said, they're not. She heard something in his voice that she recognized. Not grief exactly, or not only grief, but the specific quality of a person who's had something taken from them, slowly enough that they had to watch it go. She thought about what Nora had told her in the first week. He lost someone years back. And she didn't ask because you didn't ask, and because she understood without needing to know the details that the asking wouldn't help. Get some sleep, she said. You're moving 300 cattle through a mountain in the morning. He almost smiled. She'd gotten better at reading the particular geography of his face. The near smile was different from the settled into something expression, which was different from the closed expression that meant he was working through something he wasn't ready to say. The near smile was small and came and went fast, but it was real. Yes, ma'am, he said, which was the first time he'd said that to her, and it had a quality to it that she thought about after he'd gone. But the drive started at first light on Sunday. Silas at the front with Cal and 8 of the best drovers, the cattle moving out of the east pasture in the specific way of 300 animals being asked to go somewhere they hadn't been. Reluctant, reading the humans for information, falling into the rhythm of movement once it was established. Elena watched them go from the yard, then she went back inside. The day ran strangely without the full crew. The ranch was quieter than she'd ever heard it. 7 men left behind for essential operations, Nora and Tom and the 2 cleaning women. Elena cooked for 7, and it felt like nothing after weeks of 40. She spent the extra hours doing the deep cleaning that never had time during regular operation, scrubbing the shelves, taking inventory of what would need to be ordered when the supply run came in April, re-rendering the lard she'd been meaning to do properly for 3 weeks. She slept better that night than she had in a while, which surprised her. She'd expected to lie awake thinking about the pass. Instead, she went under quickly and slept without dreaming, and woke before her alarm and lay in the dark for a minute before getting up. Monday was routine. She fed the 7 men and did her work and did not check the clock more than she could help it. Tuesday was harder. By Tuesday afternoon, she was calculating. They would have reached the kettle on Sunday, moved the first group through, sent the drovers back for the second before dark. Monday would have been the longest day. The bulk of the cattle moving through the shelf and down the descent and into the timber and onto the Colton Road. Tuesday they should be at the railhead, or close. She was at the range when she heard the yard come alive in the late afternoon. Voices, the sound of horses, the dogs barking in the way they barked when the gate had opened. She heard Nora say something from the front hall. She kept her hands on what she was doing. Then Cal appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was filthy and exhausted, and there was a dark stain on the left shoulder of his coat that her stomach recognized as blood before her mind caught up. "We made it," he said. "Cattle are at Colton." She set down the pot. "What happened to your shoulder?" "Ice gave out on the descent. Section of trail, maybe 40 feet. We lost 2 men in the water." He came in and sat down heavily at the work table. "I mean, we didn't lose them. We got them out. Silas went in after the second man himself. Water was damn near freezing. Elena was already at the range for the broth." "Where is he?" "Coming. He's behind us with Garrett and the last of the drovers. Maybe an hour." He looked at the table. "You got anything to eat? I haven't had anything since this morning." "Where exactly did this happen?" she said, ladling broth and setting it in front of him. "On the descent? Far side, about halfway down. There was a section of ice shelf we hadn't seen on the scout. Couldn't see it because it was under snow. It held the first group and half of the second, and then it gave." He drank the broth directly from the bowl and didn't apologize for it. Silas had the drovers downstream before most people knew what was happening. He was in the water himself before the second man went under. She listened to this without expression. It took a particular quality of attention that she'd developed over years and that she didn't have a name for. The ability to receive information without reacting to it outwardly until she'd processed it, which was useful in kitchens, and apparently also in this. "The men who went in, how are they?" "Cold and shaken and alive, which is the important part." He set down the bowl. Silas got the worst of it. He was in the water longer. He's moving fine, but he's cold to the bone, and he's not going to admit it. "I know," she said. She started putting things together. The broth and the bread she'd baked that morning, and the dry clothes she'd have Nora pull from the upstairs room before he arrived. And she thought about the frostbite protocol and decided that what he was going to need was heat from the inside before she worried about the outside. And she started the rye bread dough because it would be ready in 2 hours, and that was approximately when she thought he'd need it most. She was at the range when she heard the yard again, and she heard his voice. Not what he said, just the sound of it, and that told her enough. He came into the kitchen 40 minutes later. He was dry, which meant he'd changed, but the dry clothes were doing only part of the work. He moved carefully, not injured, but with the deliberate quality of a body that had been pushed into something it was going to need a few days to negotiate its way out of. His hands, when he sat down at the table, were pale, which she noted. She set the broth in front of him, then the bread, then coffee. He looked at it and then at her. "Cal told you," he said. "He told me what happened. He didn't tell me how you are." "I'm fine." "Your hands are pale." He looked at them. "They're warming up." "I know," she said. "I'm watching." She sat down across from him for the first time she could remember sitting down across from him, which was a thing she noted without making into something. "Eat first. Then I want to look at them." He ate without arguing, which told her something about how tired he was. He wasn't a man who skipped the argument unless he was past a certain point of exhaustion. He ate the bread and drank the broth and some of the coffee, and some color came back into his face in the slow way of someone whose body was catching up to the fact that it was now somewhere warm and safe. 300 head made it to Colton, he said. Cal told me. "That's $2,600 against the season," he said. "Clear." He set down the cup. Without your route, we'd have eaten that loss or settled for Portsmouth. Either way, the winter's numbers would have broken us. The route was my father's, she said. I just remembered it. That's not a small thing, he said, remembering it the way you did, trusting it. She looked at him. You trusted it too. That wasn't nothing. I trusted you, he said. Simply, the way he said things when he was too tired to dress them up. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the last of the day's light was going, and she could hear the men in the yard settling down from the return. Voices and the sound of the barn door and the dogs finally going quiet. Inside, the range was stoked well, and the bread she'd baked that morning was still warm in its cloth, and the rye she'd put up was rising properly in the cold corner of the room. She reached across the table and took his right hand and turned it palm up. The fingers were still pale at the tips, but coming back. The capillaries refilling, the color returning in the uneven way that meant the tissue was fine. She checked each finger methodically, which required her to hold his hand, which she did without remarking on it. They're fine, she said. I know they're fine, he said. But he didn't pull his hand away. She was aware of that. She set his hand down and folded hers in her lap. You should sleep, she said. Elena, he said. She looked at him. He was using her name the way he'd started to use it in the last weeks. Not the formal address, not Mercer, but the first name, which had a different quality and which she was always specifically aware of when it happened. What you did, he said. What you've done since you got here. He stopped. He was looking at the table with the expression of a man trying to put something into words that he didn't naturally put into words, which she could see was effortful and which she didn't want to interrupt. I don't know how to... He stopped again. You don't have to, she said. I want to. She waited. This ranch has been running for 12 years, McDown, he said. I've run it on discipline and stubborn and not much else since Margaret died. Oosh. He said the name plainly, without preparation, which she thought was perhaps the first time he'd said it to her, or to anyone in this kitchen, and it sat between them with the specific weight of something that had been inside a person for a long time. I told myself it was enough, that the operation was enough, that I didn't need... He stopped. And then you walked in here with a cracked-up travel bag and your mother's recipe book, and you made a loaf of rye bread, and I started coming to the kitchen more than I've come to any room in this house in the last 4 years, and I still told myself it was professional. She was very still. It's not professional, he said. The fire settled in the range. Somewhere outside, one of the horses moved in the barn. The rye dough in the corner of the kitchen was doing what dough did when it was working right, slowly, without drama, becoming something from the patient transformation of simple ingredients. No, she said quietly. I don't suppose it is. He looked at her. She looked at him. Neither of them moved for a moment that was long enough to have a character of its own. Not tense, not comfortable, but honest, which was something different from either. Get some sleep, she said. We'll talk when you've had rest and you're warm and you're not running on the end of 3 days of mountain country. That's a delay, he said. It's not a no, she said. He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded. That particular nod she'd come to recognize, the one that meant he was accepting something he wouldn't have accepted from anyone else. And he pushed back from the table and stood up. At the door he stopped. He didn't turn around. Thank you, he said, for the route. For all of it. Go sleep, she said. She listened to his boots in the hall until they were gone. Then she sat at the kitchen table in the warm quiet with her hands folded in front of her, and she let herself feel what she'd been careful with for 4 months. Not the full weight of it, not yet, but enough to know it was there, and that it was real, and that the word she'd been avoiding using, even in her own head, was the accurate one. She sat there for a while. Then she got up and checked the rye, which was doing exactly what she'd expected it to do. And she banked the fire for the night, and she went to her room, and outside the first real breath of early spring moved across the Colorado territory, like a promise that hadn't been made yet, but that the land was already preparing to keep. He slept for 14 hours. Elena knew because she was awake before him on Wednesday morning, as she always was, as she would probably always be regardless of circumstances. And she heard him come downstairs well past 9, which was 3 hours later than his usual time, and which told her more about what the drive had cost him than anything he would have said directly. She had coffee on and the remains of breakfast still warm in the covered pan, and she set it out without comment when he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked better, rested, which changed the specific architecture of his face in a way she'd noticed before. It softened something around the eyes without making him look soft. The way sleep sometimes returned a person to a version of themselves that waking hours slowly eroded. He sat down and ate and didn't say anything for the first several minutes, and she let the kitchen do what the kitchen did, which was absorb silence without making it awkward. "The Ashcroft letter came yesterday," he said. He set it to the table, to his coffee cup, in the tone of a man who had decided to say something and was doing it before he could decide otherwise. She'd seen the letter in the front hall when she'd gone to bring in the morning wood. She hadn't said anything about it. "I know," she said. "Harlan Ashcroft wants an answer on the partnership proposal," Silas said, "by end of the month." She kept her attention on what she was doing, which was preparing the midday bread. "What kind of answer?" "A business partnership is the polite description. What he actually wants is a formal commitment to the marriage arrangement. The capital investment he's offering is contingent on that." He picked up his coffee. "He's been patient," he says, "which means he's decided he's been patient long enough." "How much capital?" she said. Because it was the relevant question, and because asking it meant she was treating this as the practical matter. It also was, which was the only way she knew how to hold the complicated things, by making sure the practical dimensions were named alongside the other ones. "Enough to clear the operating debt and fund the North Pasture expansion," he said, "and build a proper bunkhouse, and update the equipment we've been nursing along for 3 years. That's a significant sum." "It is." She folded the dough. "And Vivian?" "Vivian is—" He stopped. He turned the cup in his hands. "Vivian is a reasonable woman in an unreasonable situation. She knows what the arrangement is. She'd make a sensible partner for the operation. She understands ranching finance better than most men I deal with." "But," Elena said, and she said it the way she'd said it to him back in January, quiet and without edge, because they both knew the but was there and naming it wasn't an accusation. He was quiet for a moment. "I stood in a freezing creek 2 days ago, and I thought, not about the cattle, not about the money, not about the damn Ashcroft arrangement. I thought about who I wanted to come back to. I thought about the kitchen." He looked at her directly. "I thought about you." She stopped working. "I've thought about that kind of thing before," he said. "After Margaret. I thought about it and I decided I was done with it, which is different from actually being done with it, it turns out." He set down the cup. "I'm not going to pretend I've handled this well. I haven't. I've been coming into this kitchen for 4 months under various pretexts and telling myself it was practical, and it wasn't practical, and I think you've known that longer than I have." "Yes," she said. "Then I'm going to ask you something directly," he said, "and I want you to answer me the same way." She turned around and looked at him. "All right. If I tell Harlan Ashcroft no," he said, "if I close that door, is there something here worth closing it for?" The kitchen was very quiet. Outside she could hear the yard coming to life. Cal's voice, the sound of the barn door, a horse moving on the frozen ground. Normal sounds, the regular machinery of the place. She looked at him for a long moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because the answer deserved the weight of being looked at before it was spoken. "Yes," she said, "there is." He nodded. Once. The way he nodded when something was settled. "Then I'll write to Ashcroft today," he said. Up. The letter went out with the Thursday Post rider, which meant Harlan Ashcroft would have it by the following Wednesday, which meant, by the calculation that Elena did automatically and that she suspected Silas had already done, that the response and the fallout would begin arriving sometime in the week after that. In the meantime, the ranch went on. This was the particular quality of ranch work that Elena had come to understand deeply in her months at Iron Ridge. It was relentless, not in a punishing way, but in the way of living things, which required tending regardless of what else was happening, and which didn't pause to accommodate the internal weather of the people responsible for them. Cattle needed feed and water. Fences needed checking after the winter's damage. The creek rerouting was underway on the East Pasture, which required labor and attention every day. The books from the Colton sale needed to be reconciled, and the next quarter's supply orders needed to be made. Silas worked. Elena cooked. The men did their jobs. And underneath all of it, the thing that had been said in the kitchen on Wednesday morning settled into the operation like groundwater, present but not visible, changing things at the root without disturbing the surface. She noticed small differences. He came to the kitchen now without the various pretexts he'd been using. No ledger to check, no delivery schedules to discuss. He came because the kitchen was where she was, and that was the whole of it, stated through action rather than words. He sat at the work table and drank coffee, and sometimes talked about what was happening with the operation, and sometimes didn't say much at all. And she went about her work and talked when she had something to say, and didn't when she didn't. And she noticed this carefully, aware that she was noticing it. It was easy in a way that she hadn't expected and hadn't had much experience with. Easy wasn't the word she would have chosen if asked to predict it. She would have predicted complicated, because that was what she'd known. What she found instead was something quieter than she'd anticipated, like a room you walk into that is the right temperature without trying. She was careful not to make too much of it. She was careful in general. She'd told Nora what had been said in the kitchen because Nora would have known something had shifted regardless, and because Elena trusted her enough to tell it plainly, and Nora had listened without interrupting and then sat with it for a moment and then said, "I'm glad. I'm also still telling you to be careful. Those aren't contradictions." "I know," Elena said. "The territory will have opinions," Nora said. "The territory can have them," Elena said. "It's not just opinions," Nora said, with the tone of a woman who understood frontier social architecture in ways that Elena, who was newer to it, might not. "There are people whose business interests were tied to the Ashcroft arrangement. There are people who thought they understood how this ranch was going to develop and what role it was going to play in the territory's economy. Silas closing that door affects more than just Harlan Ashcroft's feelings." Elena had understood this in the abstract. What she hadn't fully anticipated was the specific shape it took. Harlan Ashcroft's response came not by letter, but in person. He arrived on a Friday morning 2 weeks after Silas's refusal, in a good coach with 2 men on the seat and what appeared to be a legal representative inside with him. A thin man in a dark coat who got out of the coach carrying a document case with the careful deliberateness of a person who carries document cases professionally. Ashcroft himself was a big man, well-fed, with the complexion of someone who was accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered and had arranged his life to ensure this was usually true. Elena was in the kitchen when they arrived. She heard the coach in the yard, heard Nora go to the door, heard the voices in the front hall. She kept working. What she heard next was Silas's voice from his office. The particular register of his voice when he was dealing with something he'd prepared for and was not going to let off the rails. She couldn't make out the words, but she knew the tone, and she was calm about it in the specific way she was calm about things that were out of her hands, which was a quality she'd developed over years, and that cost her something every time she used it. The meeting in the office lasted close to 2 hours. She sent Nora in with coffee at the 40-minute mark. Not as a social gesture, but because it was a practical thing to do, and because it gave Nora a reason to be in the vicinity of the door. Nora came back with the empty tray and a compressed expression. "Ashcroft is threatening to call in 2 notes he holds on territory land adjacent to the north pasture," she said quietly, closing the kitchen door. "Small parcels, but if he calls them and the men who owe them can't pay, he controls the access road to the north range." Elena set down what she was holding. "Can he do that?" "His man says the notes are legitimate and the payment terms allow recall with 90 days' notice." Nora set the tray on the work table. "It's legal. Whether it's survivable depends on whether Silas can negotiate easement rights with whoever Ashcroft sells to. Or buy the notes himself before Ashcroft calls them," Elena said. Nora looked at her. "He'd need cash available. After this winter—" "I know," Elena said. She was thinking through it in the way she thought through provisioning problems. What's available? What's needed? What's the order of operations? "Who holds the notes?" "The landowners." "Do I know them?" "The Pruitt brothers," Nora said. "Frank and Dale. They've got a small grazing outfit about 3 miles north." She paused. "Why?" "Because if Silas talked to the Pruitts before Ashcroft's representative does, he might be able to arrange a private purchase directly. Cut Ashcroft out of the chain before the recall notice goes out." She looked at Nora. Has he thought of that? I don't know what he's thought of, Nora said. He's in there with Ashcroft, and I can't exactly go in and ask. Elena considered. Then she untied her apron and hung it on the hook by the range. What are you doing? Nora said. Going to find Garrett, she said. He knows the Pruitts. He ran cattle with Frank Pruitt's outfit 3 years ago, he told me. He can ride up there this afternoon and talk to them before anyone else does. She paused. Can you handle the kitchen for an hour? I've handled this kitchen longer than you've been here, Nora said, but she said it without heat and with the particular expression of a woman who had just recalibrated her understanding of something and was doing so without making a production of it. Elena went and found Garrett in the far barn. He was a practical man, and she'd always gotten along with practical men because she was one herself, in the female version of the category. She explained what she needed in plain terms, and he listened without interrupting, and at the end of it he said, The Pruitts like Silas fine. They don't like the Ashcroft crew at all. Frank Pruitt will want to hear this. Can you be back before dark? If I leave now, he said. Leave now, she said. He was saddling his horse before she got back to the kitchen. Ashcroft left in the late afternoon without the answer he'd come for, which Elena could tell from the quality of sound that came from the front hall when the coach was being prepared, a certain briskness, a door closing with more intention than necessary, the thin legal man's voice saying something abbreviated and professional. Silas came to the kitchen at 5 o'clock. He looked like a man who had been in a sustained argument for 2 hours with someone he couldn't afford to lose his temper at, which was its own particular kind of exhausting. He sat down. She put coffee in front of him. He's threatening the Pruitt notes, he said. I know, she said. I sent Garrett to the Pruitts this afternoon. He looked at her. Garrett knows Frank Pruitt, she said. If Silas Crow wants to buy those notes directly and give the Pruitts clean title to their land rather than leaving them at the mercy of whoever Ashcroft sells to, I thought Frank Pruitt might be interested in that conversation. A long pause. You did that while Ashcroft was in my office. The timing seemed relevant, she said. He looked at her with the expression she'd learned to recognize as his version of being genuinely caught off guard, which happened rarely and which he absorbed with less grace than he absorbed most things. A slight disorganization of the face, quickly resolved. Elena. It might not work, she said. If Ashcroft gets to them first, or if the legal terms don't allow direct purchase, it'll work, he said. Frank Pruitt has been looking for a reason to tell Harlan Ashcroft something impolite for the better part of 2 years. This gives him a clean one. He was still looking at her with that expression. How did you know about the notes? Nora told me when she came back with the coffee tray. And you? He stopped. You just handled it. I handled what I could handle from the kitchen, she said. The rest is your business. He sat with that for a moment. She went back to the stove, giving him the space to process it the way he processed things, internally, in his own time, without being watched. I'm going to need to do something about you, he said. She glanced over her shoulder. I beg your pardon? You can't keep being the cook, he said. That's not the right category for what you actually are. She turned around fully. What category would you suggest? He looked at her steadily. I think you know what I'd suggest. The kitchen was warm and smelled like the rosemary chicken she had in the oven, and the afternoon light was coming through the window at the angle it came at in March when the sun had started making its way back north. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and it was one of those moments where the thing that was true had been true for a while, and both people knew it, and the only question was whether to say it plainly or keep finding ways around it. That's a larger conversation than 5 o'clock on a Friday, she said. I know. But it's not a no, she said, which was what he'd said to her, and she said it deliberately, and she saw him recognize it. No, he said, with something that was fully a smile this time, arrived without apology. It's not a no. Garrett came back before dark with Frank Pruitt's handshake agreement to a private sale of the notes, terms to be worked out with Silas directly, Ashcroft excluded from the transaction entirely. The legal particulars took another week to resolve, but they resolved. Silas's attorney was a methodical man named Carr, who had been in the territory long enough to know every mechanism available and who executed the purchase with the efficiency of someone who understood that speed, in this case, was the point. When the documents were signed and the Pruitt notes were retired and clean title was established, the access road to the North Range was secure and Harlan Ashcroft's primary leverage was gone. What remained were opinions. They came from the expected places, mostly the business community in Durango that had been tracking the Ashcroft arrangement as a fixed point on the territory's financial map, the social circle that Vivian's presence had briefly made adjacent to Iron Ridge, the general category of people who had understood what the marriage would have meant and were now adjusting to what its absence meant instead. Some of it was polite. Some of it wasn't. A man named Collier, who ran the largest dry goods operation in the county and who had been expecting a supply contract from the post-merger ranch operation, came into the mercantile in town where Nora was doing the household order and said something about wasted opportunities and the poor judgment of men who let sentiment interfere with business. Nora reported this to Elena without elaboration, and Elena received it without elaboration, and they moved on. What was harder to move on from was the version that came from inside the operation. Rudy, who had never fully accepted Elena's presence in the kitchen and who had been quietly resentful of the influence she'd accumulated over the winter, made his position plain in a way that crossed the line from opinion into something more operational. He went to Breckett, the senior foreman, and laid out the argument that the ranch's business direction had been influenced by a kitchen employee with no stake in the outcome, and that this was a problem that Breckett, as a man of practical understanding, should see clearly. Breckett listened to this. Then he told Rudy that Elena Mercer had found a mountain route that saved the ranch close to 3 months of financial pressure, had managed a frostbite situation that would have cost a man his fingers if handled wrong, had identified a provisioning problem in the flour supply before it became a crisis, and had found the mechanism for neutralizing Ashcroft's legal threat on the same afternoon it was made. And that if Rudy's definition of having no stake in the outcome didn't cover those things, Breckett wasn't sure what definition Rudy was using. He told Elena about this conversation himself. He came to the kitchen one morning and sat down and told her plainly, which was the most words she'd heard Breckett say in the entire 5 months she'd been at Iron Ridge. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I did," he said, "because Rudy's going to leave anyway. He's been looking for a reason since February, and I wanted you to know that the rest of the men don't think what he thinks." "Do they think something else?" Breckett considered. "They think you kept this place running through the hardest winter in recent memory. They think the food got better. They think young Holt still has use of his right hand, and they think—" He stopped, calibrating. "They think the boss seems like himself again in a way he hasn't been for a while. And they don't have a problem with any of that." She looked at her work table for a moment. "Thank you, Breckett." "Ma'am," he said, and got up and went back to his work. Silas brought it up on a Sunday evening in late March, which she would later think was not an accident. Sundays were the only day that had a different quality to it at Iron Ridge. Not a day off, but a day with different rhythms. The work essential rather than expansive, the evenings quieter. He came into the kitchen after supper, after the men had gone to the bunkhouse, and Nora and Tom had gone to their house, and the ranch had settled into its night sounds. He was carrying something. She saw it when she turned around, a small thing, a ring that he set on the work table without ceremony and without explanation, just placed it there and looked at it. She looked at it too. "That was my grandmother's," he said. "She came out here from Ohio in 1848 with my grandfather, who had $40 and a wagon and a letter from a man who may or may not have owned the land he was selling. She buried 2 children on the trail and started over twice before they made anything that lasted." He looked at the ring. "She was a particular kind of woman. My grandfather used to say she was the reason anything worked. He said it like it was obvious." Elena was very still. I'm not good at the words for this," he said. "I don't have practice with it. The last time I did this, I was 23 and I didn't know what I was doing and I lost her anyway, and I told myself I wasn't going to put myself in a position to lose that way again." He looked up at her. "But I've been watching you hold this place together since November, and I've been watching you make decisions that I should have been consulted on, and that you made better than I would have, and I've been coming into this kitchen every day for 5 months and telling myself it was about something other than what it was about. And I'm tired of pretending that the most capable and honest person I've encountered in a decade is just my cook." She had both hands on the edge of the work table. She was listening with the same quality of attention she brought to everything, complete without performance. "I'm asking you to marry me," he said, "not because it makes operational sense, not because it's practical, not because it would fix any particular problem, because I come into this kitchen and everything in me that's been locked down since Margaret died opens back up, and I don't want to spend the rest of my life pretending that isn't true." The fire in the range made the small sound it made when it was well fed and burning clean. Outside the window, the night was warmer than it had been all winter. Not warm, but the cold had lost its edge, and there was the specific smell of the air in late March when the ground was starting to breathe again. She looked at him. She looked at the ring on the work table. She thought about standing at the gate of this ranch in November with a cracked travel bag and resoled boots and her mother's recipe journal and nothing else to recommend her. And she thought about the particular quality of having nothing left to lose, which she'd learned was not the same as freedom, but that was sometimes the same as clarity. She thought about her mother, who had cooked for a family in a farm for 30 years, and had never once believed that the cooking was less than the other things, who had believed, in fact, that the cooking was how everything else held together, and that what happened at a table and over a fire was not domestic and small, but was precisely the thing that made a life instead of just an existence. "You need to understand something first," she said. He waited. "I'm not going to become less than I am because I'm married to you," she said. "I'm not going to stop having opinions about how things are done or stay quiet when I see something that needs to be said. I'm not going to manage myself down to the size of what people expect from a rancher's wife." She met his eyes directly. "If that's what you need, I'm the wrong woman." "That's what I need," he said. "Specifically that." She looked at him for a long moment more. Then she reached out and picked up the ring from the work table. It was plain gold, worn smooth with age. It fit on her right hand, too loose for the ring finger on her left, which she noted with a practical mind that was already thinking ahead to solutions. She looked at it on her hand. "Yes," she said. He exhaled, a short, slightly uneven breath that she recognized as the sound of a man releasing something he'd been holding tighter than he'd realized. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They stood on opposite sides of the work table with the ring on her hand and the fire going in the range, and everything that had accumulated over 5 months of work and weather and the particular kind of proximity that honest daily effort creates between people who are paying attention. They stood with all of that around them in the warm kitchen, and it wasn't romantic the way some people thought romance had to look. Wasn't dramatic or sweeping, and that was fine. That was what ours, she thought, closer to the real thing anyway. "I should tell you," she said, "that the ring will need to be sized." "I know," he said. "I thought about that. Carr's wife does jewelry work." "You thought about that before you came in here tonight?" "I've been thinking about tonight for 3 weeks," he said. She looked at him with something she rarely showed without intending to. Not warmth, exactly, or not only warmth, but a specific quality of recognition, of two people seeing each other clearly and finding that what they see is what they were hoping for. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." Yet, the news moved through Iron Ridge the way news moved through a closed operation. Not announced, not with any formality, but through the accumulation of small signals that people who worked closely together read without being told. Silas came to breakfast Monday morning, and there was something different in the way he moved through the room. And Elena stood at the range in the same way she always stood there, and yet somehow not the same. And Cal watched both of them for about 4 minutes, and then went and said something quiet to Beckett, and by noon, the bunkhouse knew. The response was not uniform. Rudy collected his pay on Tuesday and left, which nobody was surprised by and nobody mourned. 2 of the other hands had versions of his position that were less vocal but equally felt, and Elena was aware of them and did not pretend otherwise. She went about her work. The food on the table was what it always was, which was the only argument she'd ever had and the only one she needed. But on Tuesday evening, when she brought out the dishes for supper, Cal stood up when she came in. Stood up in the middle of a sentence he was in the middle of saying, for no reason except that she'd walked in with her hands full and it seemed like the right thing to do. And Beckett passed the breadbasket to her end of the table first, which was a small thing and was also not small at all. And the Holt brothers, both of them, watched her set down the platter with expressions on their faces that were not complicated, just clear, the way a thing is clear when you've made up your mind about it and stopped requiring additional information. Young Holt, whose right hand still worked, whose fingers had come back full and functional, looked at her and said, "Good stew tonight, Miss Mercer." She looked at him. "Thank you, Holt?" He nodded and went back to eating. It wasn't a ceremony. It wasn't a speech or a declaration. It was a 20-year-old ranch hand saying thank you over a bowl of stew and meaning it. And sometimes that was the thing that cost the most to earn and mattered the most when it came. The territory's opinion continued to arrive in various forms over the following days. The mercantile proprietor's coolness when Silas was in town, the absence of a dinner invitation that had been semi-standing with one of the neighboring ranch families, a pointed editorial comment from a man in the county seat whose newspaper covered territory business news. Silas received these without visible concern. Elena received them the same way. What they had was not the absence of opposition. What they had was something that had been tested by a winter that had tried everything it had, cold and debt, and a mountain with an impassable road, and a banker with legal leverage, and 37 men watching to see what they were made of, and had held. She thought about that on a Wednesday evening, standing at the kitchen window in the last of the March light, looking out at the yard where the mud was beginning to show through the snow in the places the sun hit first. The mountains above the tree line were still white, but differently white than they'd been in January. The snow had a different character in late March, denser and heavier, losing the dry powder quality of deep winter and taking on the weight of a thing that was beginning. Slowly, its long argument with spring. Silas came in behind her. She heard him at the door, and then she felt him standing beside her, not touching, just present, looking at the same yard and the same mountains. "Carr says the documents will be finalized by end of week," he said. She knew he meant the Pruitt notes, the formalization of what the handshake had settled. "Good. Supply run next Monday. I have the list ready." "I know you do," he said. They stood there for a moment. The light on the mountains was going, the last of the afternoon color draining from the western face of the Grenner Range, the peaks going from gold to gray to the particular blue of high altitude in the minutes before dark. "My father would have liked this place," she said. She hadn't meant to say it, or hadn't planned to say it, and it came out in the slightly unguarded way of things you say when you're looking at a landscape and your attention is split. Silas was quiet for a moment. "What was his name?" "Thomas," she said. "Thomas Mercer. He paid attention to things. He would have studied this operation for about a week and then told you 3 things you could do differently that would save you money, and he'd have been right about 2.5 of them." "And the half?" He always overestimated how quickly you could rotate pasture in mountain country. He'd never ranched at altitude. She looked at the mountains. "But he'd have learned." "The kettle," Silas said. "He'd have liked the kettle." "Yes," she said. "He would have." She felt Silas's hand find hers at her side. Not dramatically, not with announcement, just the particular gravity of 2 people who have decided they are each other's and are still finding out what that means in the ordinary moments where it doesn't have to mean anything monumental. His hand was large and calloused and warm, and she held it, and they stood there until the mountains went fully dark, and the kitchen behind them was still warm from the day's work. And outside, the first genuine breath of spring moved across the Colorado Territory. There was still hard ground ahead. She knew that. The territory's opinion wouldn't change overnight, and there were neighbors who needed to be navigated and business relationships that needed rebuilding on different terms. And the North Range expansion would take 2 seasons and more labor than they currently had, and there would be winters again that tried what they had and tested whether it would hold. She'd always known how to hold things together. She'd learned it young, in a kitchen smaller than this one, from a woman who'd understood that what happened over a fire and at a table was not decoration for a life, but the actual substance of it. She held Silas's hand and looked at where the mountains were and thought about what it meant to build something that lasted, and she thought that she knew, that she had always known, that it started here, in the ordinary daily fact of it, in the bread on the table and the fire in the range, and 2 people deciding, with their eyes open, to choose each other over the alternatives. The kitchen waited behind them, warm and steady. There was work to do in the morning. Spring in the Colorado Territory did not arrive the way spring arrived in the lower country. Gradually, with advance notice, warming by degrees until you looked up one day and realized winter was behind you. In the high country, it arrived in arguments. A week of genuine warmth followed by 3 days of hard frost. The creek flooding its new channel and then freezing at the edges overnight. The pasture grass pushing up green and insistent through the last of the snowpack, while the mountains above the tree line held their white with the stubbornness of something that had not yet decided to let go. Elena had learned to read it. She'd learned to read most things about this place by April, the way the light moved across the yard at different hours and seasons, the particular sounds the house made in different temperatures, which of the men would need a larger breakfast before a cold morning and which would eat the same regardless. She'd learned the ranch the way she'd always learned the places she tended, through attention, through the daily repetition of being present, through caring about what she touched. April was full. There was the North Range fence work that had been deferred through the worst of winter, now underway with the ground soft enough to accept post holes. There was the creek channel on the east pasture that needed its banks stabilized before the real melt came off the mountains. There was a new hand to integrate, a young man named Cobb, 19 years old, from somewhere in Kansas, who had shown up at the gate in the second week of April with a recommendation letter from a rancher Silas knew, and with the specific look of someone who was starting over in the particular way of the very young, before they understand that starting over is something you do more than once. Elena fed him, as she fed all of them, with the bread on the table and the hot coffee and the food that was made for people who worked, and not for people who were performing the eating of food. And within 3 days, Cobb had figured out what all the others had figured out, that the kitchen was the center of the operation in a way that the bunkhouse and the barn and the cattle pens were not, and that the woman who ran it was the center of the kitchen in a way that didn't require announcement. She heard Cal tell him that, in fact, in the yard on a Thursday morning. She was at the kitchen window getting a jar from the shelf, not listening, but in the way of kitchens and windows, which was that she heard things. "You want to understand how this place works," Cal said. "You start with the kitchen. Everything else follows from there." Cobb said something she didn't catch. "Because she keeps it running," Cal said. "Same as she kept it running all winter. You'll figure out what I mean." She put the jar back on the shelf and went back to the range and didn't mention it to anyone. The wedding date was set for the second Saturday in May, which gave enough time for the immediate practicalities and not so much time that the surrounding opinion had too long to organize itself into something that needed to be navigated. This was Elena's logic, and she offered it plainly when Silas asked her preference on the timing, and he had looked at her with the expression he wore when something she said was precisely right, in a way that was slightly inconvenient for him to acknowledge, and said, "Second Saturday in May, then." The territory's opinion had not improved exactly, but it had changed texture. The people who were going to be irreconcilable about it had made that plain and were not going to spend time on it further. The people who were uncertain had been watching Iron Ridge through the winter, and the cattle drive and the Ashcroft situation, and had arrived, by various routes, at a version of the same conclusion. The ranch was functioning, the cattle had been delivered, the financial threat had been neutralized, and the man running the operation seemed, by all visible evidence, to be clearer-headed than he'd been in years. These were the observable facts, and in territory where observable facts carried more weight than social convention, they mattered. There were 2 women from town who came to see Elena in the second week of April. They arrived together on a Wednesday afternoon. Mrs. Frances Aldridge, who was the wife of the county surveyor and who had a reputation for precision that extended from her husband's work into her own opinions, and Mrs. Cora Devlin, who ran the seamstress operation off the main street and who had been making clothes for the ranch's household for 6 years. They came in through the kitchen door, which was either a social signal or a practical one, and sat down at the work table and accepted coffee. "We want to help with the wedding preparations," Mrs. Devlin said. She was a direct woman, and she said it directly, looking at Elena without the particular quality of assessment that Elena had gotten used to navigating. "I can make the dress. I've made 3 wedding dresses this year, and I know what I'm doing." "That's kind of you," Elena said. She was calibrating, not the offer, which was genuine, but the situation, which was layered. She'd spent enough time in frontier social contexts to understand that women who came offering help were not always offering only help. "I want to say something first," Mrs. Aldridge said. She had the quality of a woman who said what she meant and considered preamble to be a form of dishonesty. "I was one of the people who thought the Ashcroft arrangement made sense. I said so. I thought it was the practical thing for the territory and for Silas, and I didn't think much beyond that." She looked at Elena steadily. "I was measuring the situation with the wrong instruments." Elena looked at her. "What you did for this ranch over the winter," Mrs. Aldridge said, and in particular what you did with the Pruitt notes. My husband handles land documents for half the county, and he told me what that move prevented. He said it was the most efficient piece of problem solving he'd seen in years." She paused. I wanted to say that before anything else. There was a quality to this that Elena found more difficult than hostility. Hostility she knew how to meet. This was something that required her to receive something gracefully, which was not a thing she'd had much occasion to practice. "Thank you," she said. She said it simply and let it land. "Now," said Mrs. Devlin, with the tone of a woman moving to business, "tell me what you want the dress to look like." They were married on a Saturday in May, with the sky the specific blue that May produced in the high country. Deep and clear and high, the kind of sky that felt farther away than usual, like it had room in it that winter had compressed. The ceremony was in the yard of Iron Ridge, which was Elena's preference and which Silas had not argued with. The mountains were behind them, still wearing white on the upper third of their height, and the lower pastures were green in the tentative and genuine way of things that had waited a long time. Carr, the attorney, served as the justice of the peace. He was a formal man, and he did it formally, which was appropriate. Cal stood at Silas's left. Nora stood at Elena's right, which she did with the particular expression of a woman who has known something was coming and has been patient about waiting for it to arrive. The men from the bunkhouse were there, all of them except Rudy, who had been gone since March, and including young Cobb, who stood at the back and was serious about it in the way of 19-year-olds at ceremonies they're experiencing for the first time and haven't decided yet how to hold. The Holt brothers were there, both of them, the younger one with his right hand in his coat pocket and the way he stood when he was cold, and then taking it out and holding it at his side in the way of a person who remembers something and decides to stop hiding it. Mrs. Devlin's dress was practical. Elena had asked for practical, and Mrs. Devlin had understood what that meant, which was a dress that was good-looking without being the kind of thing that required careful management, in a blue-gray wool that was the color of the sky an hour before dawn, and that Mrs. Devlin had trimmed with a dark ribbon at the collar and cuffs, without asking because she had the confidence of a woman who knew her work. Elena wore her mother's ring on a chain at her throat. Silas's grandmother's ring, now sized properly, was on her left hand. She had looked at herself in the small mirror in her room before coming out to the yard, and had thought, clearly, without sentiment, that she looked like herself, not polished into something she wasn't, not performing an occasion, just herself, in a good dress, on a significant morning. She'd thought her mother would have called that right. Carr said the words. They said theirs. Silas put his hand over hers when they were said, not dramatically, but with the particular weight of a man who meant it entirely and had no need to amplify that. The Holt boys started clapping first, which surprised everyone including himself, and then the rest followed, and Cal said something to Beckett that made Beckett's mouth do the thing it did when he was trying not to smile and failing, and Nora put her arm briefly through Elena's and then released it, which was enough. The food afterward was Elena's, because of course it was. She'd made it over 2 days, the roast beef and the potato gratin and the rye bread in 4 loaves and the dried apple pie that she'd made twice before to get the pastry right in the mountain air and had now gotten right. She'd made the molasses cookies because the Holt brothers had never forgotten the first batch at Christmas, and she was not above that kind of thing. Nora had helped, and Mrs. Devlin had come out the day before to help and had turned out to be unexpectedly competent with pastry, which Elena told her plainly, and which Mrs. Devlin received with the satisfaction of someone who'd known it and was glad to have it acknowledged. They ate in the yard at long tables that Tom had built from plank lumber, and the mountains were above them catching the afternoon light, and the air was warm enough to be outside without a coat for the first time in months. And it was a good afternoon. Not perfect. Young Cobb knocked over a jar of pickled beets and spent 5 minutes apologizing to Elena in a way that suggested he was nervous about everything and needed someone to tell him it was fine. So she told him it was fine and gave him a second piece of pie, and he relaxed. One of the horses got out of the south paddock mid-afternoon, and 3 of the hands had to leave the table to get it back, which they did while still holding their food, because ranchers. The rye bread ran out faster than she'd expected, and she made a mental note for the future about quantities, which was the kind of thing she thought about, even on days like this one in which she'd stopped apologizing to herself for. The afternoon went on in the way of good afternoons, which is to say, too quickly. The mountains went gold. The air cooled. People drifted toward the bunkhouse or their homes with the specific contentment of people who've eaten well and been somewhere real. Silas sat beside her at the long table as the afternoon thinned, and they sat together without needing to fill it, which was something she'd been noticing for months, and that she thought was one of the truest measures of the thing they had, that the quiet between them was comfortable rather than something that needed to be fixed. "Your father would have liked today," he said. She thought about that. He would have approved of the rye bread. He would have had opinions about the service being outdoors. He'd have said that was right, that you shouldn't be inside for something that matters that much. She looked at the mountains. He would have liked you, I think. He didn't like many people quickly, but he liked people who did what they said they'd do. "I'm not sure I've always done that." "You've been doing it," she said. "That's what counts." He looked at her with the expression she'd come to think of as his most honest one. Not the near smile and not the assessing look, but something quieter and more open. The face he had when he'd stopped managing himself and was just there. She thought about Margaret, whose name she'd heard only once and whom she'd built a picture of from fragments. A woman Silas had loved at 23, whose loss had been significant enough to close something in him for close to 2 decades. She didn't feel the need to compete with that or to qualify it. The dead don't require displacement. They sit where they sit, and life builds around them, and that's how it goes. "I want to say something," she said. He waited. "I know what this cost you," she said. "The Ashcroft arrangement, the capital, the connections, the things that come with that kind of alliance. I know the North Range expansion is going to take longer now. I know there are business relationships that are going to need rebuilding. I'm not pretending those things aren't real. They're real," he said, "and they're manageable. I know they're manageable, but I want you to know that I know they cost something, that I'm not unaware of what you gave up." She looked at the table. "And I intend to make sure it was worth giving up." He was quiet for a moment. "Elena, I went in a freezing creek in March, and the thing I thought about was coming back to your kitchen. You were worth it before you said that." She looked at him. "I know, but I wanted to say it anyway." "All right," he said. "I heard it." Because May turned into June, and June turned into the first real summer Iron Ridge had seen in 3 lean years. The North Range fence was finished by the last week of May, which put the crew ahead of schedule, and which Breckett reported with the satisfaction of a man who liked being ahead of schedule and didn't often get to be. The East Pasture Creek ran clean in its new channel, and the water trough filled reliably, which resolved a problem that had been partially resolved all winter and was now actually resolved. The summer grazing rotation went on to the upper pastures as planned, the cattle moving in the organized way of animals that knew what the pattern was and cooperated with it, and the grass on the lower pastures began the recovery that Silas had been managing toward for 2 years. The business connections that the Ashcroft refusal had disrupted began to reconfigure. It happened slowly, the way these things happen, not with dramatic reconciliation, but with the gradual return of practical engagement. A rancher named Whitmore, whose eastern pasture shared a fence line with Iron Ridge's north section, came to talk about a joint water arrangement in June. The buyer who'd taken the Colton delivery came back with a standing offer for the fall run. Carr introduced Silas to a land bank in Denver that was doing territory investment differently than the old family money model, and 2 meetings later there was a conversation worth having about the North Range expansion on terms that didn't require anyone to marry anyone. None of it happened fast. None of it happened without friction. That was the nature of the thing, which Elena understood better than most people who hadn't built something from the ground up and then watched it get knocked sideways and had to build again. She ran the kitchen. She ran it the way she'd been running it since November, with the same discipline and the same attention and the same refusal to let the standard slip because the circumstances had changed. The bread was on the table in the morning. The broth was on the back burner all day. The men ate well and they knew it, and it was in the knowing that the real function of the thing lived, not just the calories and the warmth, but the sense that someone had thought about what they needed and made it happen, which was a small form of being seen and which mattered to people more than they usually said. She also did other things. She sat in on the quarterly accounts meeting in June at Silas's invitation and asked 2 questions that Carr said were the right questions, which she'd known before asking but had asked anyway because knowing the right question is only useful if you say it. She rode the east fence with Silas on a Saturday in late June. Not because she needed to see it, but because he'd asked if she wanted to, and she'd said yes, and they'd spent 4 hours on horseback talking about the ranch and the fall plans and the things they disagreed about, which were real, and which they argued about with the specific quality of two people who were not afraid of their own disagreements. She won 2 of the 3, which was roughly accurate to the merits, and which Silas accepted with the slightly pained grace of a man who'd asked for honest partnership and was now living in it. She wrote to a woman in Durango who had been her mother's friend years earlier, a woman named Pauline who'd moved west the same year her parents had, and who she'd been out of contact with for a long time and had been meaning to write since she'd arrived at Iron Ridge, and had kept not doing for reasons that had to do with the particular difficulty of reaching back into your past when you're in the middle of building something new. She wrote the letter in June and sent it with the postwriter, and didn't know if it would find Pauline or if Pauline would write back, but she sent it because her mother would have said you send the letter, and the sending is what you can control. Pauline wrote back in July. The summer ran long and mostly dry, which was better than wet, but not as good as what the cattle needed. And by August there was a careful conservation of the creek water that required attention and daily management. Elena learned to read the water the way she'd learned to read everything else about the place, by being in it, by paying attention, by asking questions of the people who knew it better than she did. Young Cobb turned out to be useful in a specific way that became apparent by midsummer. He was methodical about water monitoring in a way that some men were naturally suited to and that couldn't be taught to men who weren't. Elena noticed it and mentioned it to Silas, who moved Cobb to the water management rotation, which was where he stayed and at which he was genuinely good. He came to the kitchen one August morning and told Elena that the South Trough was showing signs of the problem she'd noticed the week before and that he'd already flagged it for Beckett. "Good," she said. "You were right about it last week," he said. "I should have caught it sooner." "You caught it before it was a problem," she said. "That's what matters." He looked at her with the expression of a young person who is trying to figure out how to calibrate between self-criticism and practical assessment and hasn't quite found the balance yet. How do you decide when something's good enough and when it needed to be better?" She thought about it. It was a real question, and it deserved a real answer. You ask whether what you did protected what you were responsible for. If the answer is yes, it was good enough. If the answer is no, you figure out why, and you fix it. You don't spend time on the other version of it, because the other version doesn't make the trough work better. He thought about that. That's practical. "Ranching is practical," she said. "So is most of life if you let it be." He nodded the nod of a 19-year-old receiving something he didn't fully have the experience to assess yet, but was storing for later. She recognized the nod. She'd been doing the storing herself for years and was still doing it. In September, something happened that she hadn't expected and that she thought about for a long time afterward. A woman came to the gate of Iron Ridge on a Tuesday morning. A woman maybe 10 years older than Elena, traveling alone in a small wagon with a horse that had seen better conditions. She said her name was Ruth Cosby, and that she was trying to reach her sister's homestead claim, which was approximately 12 miles east, and that she'd lost the road in the dark the previous night and had been trying to find it since dawn. Elena brought her in and fed her and let her rest for 2 hours, while her horse was watered, and the ranch hand she'd asked to look at the wagon's left wheel looked at it and confirmed it was sound enough to make 12 miles. She packed her a parcel of food for the road and drew her a map to the sister's claim, which she knew because Silas had told her about the claims in the east section when they'd ridden that fence in June. The woman sat at the kitchen table before she left and looked at Elena with a quality of attention that had something complicated in it. "You don't know me," she said. "No," Elena said. "But you fed me and rested my horse and sent for someone to check the wheel." "You needed those things," Elena said. "Most places I would have been told to keep moving," the woman said. "A woman alone in a wagon, nobody knows her." Elena looked at her. "My mother used to say that a table that doesn't have room for a stranger isn't really a table. It's just furniture." She set the food parcel on the table between them. She was right about most things. Ruth Cosby looked at the parcel and then at Elena, and something moved across her face that she didn't name and that Elena didn't ask about. "Thank you," she said. 12 miles east," Elena said. "You'll be there before dark." She watched the wagon go from the kitchen window, and she thought about her mother, who had fed people at a kitchen table on a farm in a drought year when there was barely enough, who had done it without calculation and without keeping score, who had believed with the specific conviction of someone who'd tested the idea against real life that what you gave at a table came back to you in ways you couldn't predict, and that keeping account of it was missing the point. She thought about arriving at this gate in November with a travel bag that weighed nothing and boots with a separating sole and a recipe journal that was all she had left. She thought about Nora opening the kitchen door and setting coffee in front of her without knowing who she was or whether she was worth knowing. She thought about what a table with room in it had meant to her then, and she thought about what it meant now to be the person who kept that table. This was the thing she had learned, or had been relearning since November, in ways that went deeper than the first time she'd known it. That a home was not a building. It was a practice. It was the daily act of showing up and making the fire, and putting the bread on and feeding the people who needed feeding, and fixing the things that needed fixing, and staying when staying was hard. It was not a state you achieved. It was something you did, every day, and the doing was the point. The ranch had been running for 12 years. It had been productive and disciplined and had made money in the good years and survived the bad ones. But a ranch that runs on discipline alone is a machine. It takes more than that to make it a place where a young hand from Kansas stores advice for later, and a foreman allows himself to almost smile, and a man who shut himself down after grief starts coming to the kitchen again because something in the kitchen tells him he's still alive. It takes someone who means it. She'd always meant it, and now there was a place around her that showed what that meant. If you looked, not in anything dramatic, not in anything you could put in a newspaper or put a price on, but in the specific quality of the life that was being lived here, day by day, in the same way that bread was made day by day, patiently and with attention and with the understanding that you couldn't rush the rise. Autumn came, and with it the preparations for the fall cattle run, which they were approaching differently this year. Better capitalized, better planned, with a route that no longer required improvisation, because Cal had ridden the kettle 3 times over the summer and mapped it properly, and it was now a viable option in the Iron Ridge playbook for the years to come. The name her father had given it, the kettle, stuck, because Cal used it when he wrote up his notes, and Breckett used it in the planning meeting, and after that it was just what the route was called, which was the way places got their names in that country. Someone knew something, and they told it, and it stayed. Silas told her that in the fall meeting with the Denver Land Bank, the officer handling their account had mentioned the Colton Drive, had actually known about it, had heard it from the Colton buyer, who had apparently mentioned it to someone, who had mentioned it to someone else, which was how things traveled in a territory where 30 miles felt like next door. The officer had said that the ability to find a viable alternative route through the Grenner Range when the standard options were closed was the kind of operational resourcefulness that serious investors found reassuring. Silas had told her this in the kitchen on a Tuesday evening with the specific expression of a man who was amused by something and not trying to hide it. "So the kettle is now a financial reference," she said. "Apparently. My father would have found that both satisfying and slightly absurd." "What do you find it?" She thought about it. "Accurate," she said. "He paid attention to a piece of country that nobody else was paying attention to, and it turned out to matter. That's how most useful things work." "Is that a general philosophy or a specific observation?" "Both," she said, and went back to what she was doing, and he stayed at the table drinking his coffee in the way he stayed now, not under any pretext, just because he was there, and this was where they were and there was nowhere else he needed to be. The fall run went clean. 340 head this time, the additional 40 from the expansion on the North Range through the kettle, on a clear October morning when the first frost had made the footing firm and the sky was the deep Pacific blue of high altitude in the fall. Cal ran it with Garrett and 8 of the hands. Silas stayed at the ranch for the first time since they'd been running cattle. Elena had said nothing about this, had not asked for it, and he'd decided it himself, which was different and which she understood was its own kind of statement. He was in the yard when the crew came back, and she was in the kitchen, and she heard the yard come alive, and she kept working, and when he came through the kitchen door, he was already telling her the numbers before he was fully inside, which was the way he told her things now, as if she were already part of the accounting, which she was. The sale cleared cleanly. The numbers were the best in 5 years. Nora sat down with Elena in the mid-afternoon of the day after the crew's return, The two of them in the kitchen in the quiet hour, coffee between them, the particular ease of two women who had worked alongside each other long enough to not need to organize the conversation before they had it. "I want to ask you something," Nora said, "and you can tell me it's not my business." "It's always your business," Elena said. "You knew this ranch before I did. Are you happy here?" Elena looked at her. It was a simple question, and the simplest questions were sometimes the hardest because they required you to mean what you said and not say what you thought you should mean. "Yes," she said. "I am." She turned the coffee cup in her hands. "It's not what I expected my life to look like. I don't think I had a picture of what I expected it to look like. But this," she thought about how to say it, "this feels like the right shape, like something I fit in." "You built it to fit you," Nora said. "We built it," Elena said. "That's the point." Nora accepted this with a nod that had something warm and satisfied in it, the expression of a woman who had watched something develop over months, and who had held her opinion through the uncertainty and was now vindicated in the specific quiet way of people who were right and didn't need to say so. The afternoon went on. The mountains outside the window were doing the thing they did in October. The aspens on the lower slopes had gone gold, and the higher timber had gone the dark reddish-brown that preceded the final drop, and the snow line had come back down to where it had been in November when Elena had walked through the gate with her travel bag and her Resoled boots and her mother's journal. A full cycle. The same mountains, the same cold starting at the top and working its way down. The same light. Different, though. Everything different. On an evening in late October, Elena took the recipe journal from the shelf in her room where she kept it and sat at the kitchen table with it in the good lamplight and opened it. She did this sometimes, still, not out of grief anymore, or not only out of grief, but because the journal was a living document in the way her mother had meant it to be, a thing that accumulated rather than closed. She had been adding to it for months. New entries in her own handwriting, a slightly more angular script than her mother's, filling in the remaining blank pages at the back. Notes on cooking at altitude, which her mother had never done. The bone broth proportions she'd developed for the ranch kitchen. The rye bread timing adjusted for winter cold and summer dry heat, both. The venison stew from the Holt brothers' deer, which she'd made 4 times now and had right. She turned to a blank page near the back and picked up her pen. She thought about what she would write. She thought about what her mother had written. The principles, the practical notes, the knowledge compressed into the language of someone who'd learned it by doing it and wanted to make sure it wasn't lost. She thought about what she'd learned at Iron Ridge that hadn't been in the journal before. She wrote, "The kitchen is not separate from the life. It is the life. This is not a limitation. This is the whole point." She looked at it. Then she wrote, "Feed people what they actually need, which is sometimes different from what they ask for. Know the difference." She looked at that. Then, "A home is not a building. It is a practice. You make it every day, or it unmakes itself." She set down the pen. Silas came in from the hall, and she heard him stop in the doorway when he saw her at the table with the journal. He came in and looked over her shoulder at what she'd written, not intrusively, just the way of someone who was part of the space and didn't need to perform courtesy in it. "Your mother's?" he said. "Mine now," she said. "Both." He looked at the pages for a moment. He read what she'd written. Then he went to the range and poured himself a coffee and stood there with it, looking at the journal from across the room. "That last one," he said. "You make it every day or it unmakes itself?" "Yes," she said. "I know something about the unmaking," he said. "I know you do," she said. "That's why I wrote it down." He was quiet for a moment. Then he brought his coffee to the table and sat down across from her, the journal between them, and the lamp burning steadily in the warm kitchen of Iron Ridge Ranch on a late October evening while the mountains above them gathered the season's first real snow, and the cattle were in the lower pastures, and the men were in the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet, with the particular quiet of a place that had been made into something by the people inside it. This was what it had come to after all of it, after the drought, and the walk through the gate, and the winter, and the mountain, and the ice, and the argument with money, and the argument with opinion. A kitchen table, a lamp, a journal that was half one woman and half another. 2 people who had come to each other the hard way, and had found, On the other side of all the hard, something that neither of them had exactly been looking for, and both of them recognized as the thing they'd needed. There are people who wait their whole lives for the right circumstances to begin living the way they mean to. They wait for the debt to clear, or the weather to improve, or the right person to arrive, or the community to stop watching, or the fear to pass. They make the conditions for their life more important than the life itself. And while they're waiting, the time goes. Elena Mercer had never had the luxury of waiting. She'd learned, young and through loss, that the circumstances were never going to be right, that the right time was always going to be this time or no time, and that the kitchen fire had to be built in the morning regardless of what the night before had looked like. She'd carried that understanding through the drought and the grief and the walk through a gate in November, and she'd set it to work in this kitchen, and it had built something that neither money alone nor love alone could have built. Something made from daily effort and honest dealing and the specific dignity of work done with attention and care. Silas Crow had built a ranch. He'd built it with grit and intelligence and the kind of stubborn endurance that frontier country either developed in you or broke you with. But he'd built it alone, in the way that people build alone when they've decided that alone is the only version they can trust. What he'd found was that you could build enormous things alone and still have an empty kitchen. The kitchen was not empty now. Outside, the snow began to fall on Iron Ridge, quietly, without drama, the way the good things sometimes arrived. It fell on the pastures and the fence lines and the new channel of the East Creek. It fell on the barn and the bunkhouse where 38 men were sleeping. It fell on the mountains above everything, adding to what was already there, and the mountains held it with the same permanent indifference they'd always had. The same endurance that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with what they were made of. Inside, the lamp burned. The range held its heat. The recipe journal lay open on the table, one woman's handwriting and then another's, the knowledge passing the only way knowledge really passes, from one person who meant it to another who would. Elena reached across and turned to the next blank page. There was more to write. There always was.